Tonight, we won't step into battlefields or grand ballrooms. We'll move instead into a room where the air is heavy enough to hold a secret, where the curtains breathe slower than you do, and every flower in the vase is saying something it shouldn't. Not history carved in marble, but written in petals and perfume, in the weight of a violet's modest bow, in the daring tilt of a red carnation, in the silent fascination a fern pretends not to feel, because in this world, language had roots and stems and leaves. Every bouquet was a coded confession, every ribbon a seal on something unspoken. The Victorians loved their rules, but they loved breaking them quietly even more. And tonight, we'll read those floral sentences the way they meant to be read in. Lamplight, slowly, with the door half-dashed closed dot, so lower the lights. Let your hands rest. And if you notice your breathing softening, that's just the past leaning a little closer. If whispered histories like this soothe you, you might consider subscribing. And if you leave the time and place you're listening from, perhaps the next story will bloom where you are. Asterisk. If you're still awake by the time we reach the scandalous topic of postal schedules, yes. Truly scandalous, feel free to subscribe or nod off, or both. Nothing urgent is going to happen here. All we will do is trace small threads in thick carpets, the sort that hold a day's worth of footsteps and say nothing about them, and we will listen to how silence, with practice, becomes a kind of dialect. Victorian. Public morality gave itself long titles and stiff collars. Sermons on chastity described temptation as if it were a fog rolling off the Thames, unavoidable, miserable, and definitely someone else's fault. The newspaper scolded with satisfying regularity, a kind of national metronome, a case in the police court, a lecture at the Mechanics Institute, reforms promised again. Respectability meant acting as if you were constantly being watched by a polite but relentless neighbor. Curtains were heavy and street lamps were spaced far apart, but the mind supplied the rest, inventing an audience of thousands every time. Someone reached for a fourth sugar cube, yet the same people who tutted at novels bought them in multitudes. And the same press that deplored French influence imported French perfumes for Christmas. Middle-class homes adopted the double life with the efficiency of a new appliance, all gleaming brass on the outside, quietly whirring cogs within. The drawing room displayed watercolors of alpine scenery. The writing desk concealed a tiny locked compartment for letters that arrived stamped with intriguing foreign addresses. Florography handbooks sat beside gardening catalogs as if they were both about soil pH. Somewhere between the parlor poems and the whatnot shelf of porcelain animals, an etiquette guide whispered that gentlemen must never discuss the body, which turned the body into the only thing left to think about. Courtship was meant to be orderly and slow, like learning the pianoforte one finger at a time. Conversation avoided the obvious. How changeable the weather has been, a suitor might say, which, with the right hydrangea pinned to the right ribbon, could mean, my heart is the barometer. Please take a reading. There were calling cards with corners folded to indicate urgency, but never too much urgency. And there were supervised afternoon walks where every step contained at least 3 interpretations. It is difficult to imagine, in our world of instant messages and interpretive emojis, that someone once waited 4 days for a reply because the postman's route did not include Sunday and because a lilac meant first love, while a white rose meant silence and one did not send the wrong weather report. It would be comical if it were not so beautifully inefficient. Behind all this politeness lay a practical anxiety, the wedding night. Instructional books hovered gently over the subject as if it were a sleeping infant. Some advised complete innocence. As a kind of virtue, others recommended a scientific tone that made affection sound like a chemistry set. The language sprouted passive things would be attempted, undertaken, or accomplished, like tasks on a household list. A few writers, especially doctors, warned of dire consequences from self-abuse. A term so broad it could include almost anything that produced a smile without witnesses. The warnings were impressively inventive. A single indiscretion might cause pallor, lassitude, and a lifelong dislike of algebra. Preparation for marriage was therefore a series of elaborate detours. Mothers instructed daughters in needlework and not in nerves. Fathers offered sons lectures about industry on the theory that well-polished boots could stand in for a steady temperament, and perhaps they can. There were, of course, private conversations, more honest and complicated, carried out while folding linen or while walking briskly across a field, because we have always saved our truths for when our hands are busy. Still, through it all, the dominant tone was caution. Even joy needed a chaperone. Contraception flickered at the edges of public discussion like a candle avoiding drafts. Devices existed and were advertised with coy euphemisms. Marriage aids, hygienic sheaths, preventive powders, each promising discretion and domestic harmony. Pamphlets circulated. Some were seized by authorities. Some were defended. In court by people who believed, with a seriousness that keeps strange company with our sleepy purposes tonight, that knowledge could be a form of compassion. Meanwhile, apothecaries sold rubber in quiet paper parcels. One could argue that Victorian prudery kept these topics in the shadows, but shadows are where nocturnal creatures thrive, and the marketplace adapted the way ivy finds mortar. Medical manuals added another layer-firm tone, Latin garnish. They recommended moderate diets, favorable attitudes toward fresh air, and for the nervous, rest cures that required fainting couches and seaside boarding houses. Doctors counted symptoms and applied phrases like neurasthenia, the way decorators applied antimacassars to chair backs, widely, hopefully, and in a pattern. A reader of such manuals might learn an astonishing amount about the digestive tract while learning very little about tenderness. It was science, yes, but with the volume turned down dot away from the hearthrug. The city conducted a different seminar after dark. London streets braided together populations that official maps pretended were separate. There were brothels with red lamps and brothels without lamps at all, discreet boarding houses, and neighborhoods where the pavement kept the secrets of thousands of shoes. Estimates of sex workers varied wildly, which is another way of saying that counting was used as a moral instrument. Reformers founded rescue homes. Newspapers visited the poor with adjectives, and the Contagious Diseases Acts tried to treat morality as if it were a medical quarantine. As you can imagine, this produced statistics and arguments, but not necessarily comfort. The people called ladies of the night had biographies like anyone else, which they were seldom asked to tell. Some were itinerant, some were managers, some treated their work like a trade with schedules and regulars. They watched the clock, the police, and the weather in that order. Their clients likewise varied from sailors paid that afternoon, too. Clerks who carried their ledgers in their heads even to the threshold. The city's gaslights hummed. The hansom cabs rattled. The Thames kept rolling, unpersuaded by anyone's sermon dot at higher elevations of society, where carpets were thick enough to erase the sound of a footstep. Relationships played out in coded comforts. A titled gentleman might maintain a friendship with a celebrated actress, sending her monogram stationery and, more practically, a brown envelope of banknotes that did not require monogramming. Houses in Mayfair contained drawing rooms that were almost entirely composed of conversation, and conversation, like lace, is stronger than it looks. Mistresses exerted influence, sometimes on taste, sometimes on politics, often on the choice of wallpaper, which in its way is a political document. Scandals, when they emerged, did so with impressive slowness, like geological formations reported in the press that the vice societies themselves operated with a curious fervor. Part administrative, part religious, part hobby. They monitored bookstalls and theater posters, confiscated boxes of photographs at railway stations, and wrote letters dense with concern. The Obscene Publications Act was explained and re-explained as if it were a delicate machine that might go out of tune. Judges fussed with it, editors complained about it, vendors learned the art of keeping a second box under the counter. Meanwhile, actual readers developed the agile wrist flick of sliding a pamphlet inside a larger, more respectable periodical. It is likely that half of London's moral fervor went into the axial rotation required to turn a newspaper in front of a passerby. Then there was the traffic in imagery and text that went by the old-fashioned name, curiosities. Publishers flourished in the gray zones, binding slim volumes that were not advertised, but were always somehow available. The photographs were sepia, the paper a little brittle, the captions brief and almost formal, as if apologizing for existing, while also insisting on it. Private collections accumulated in hat boxes and desk drawers. When a magistrate raided a shop, another opened 3 streets away, and the customers learned new routes as easily as a cat learns new sleeping places. High society enjoyed its own episodes, reported with euphemisms so polished you could almost see your face in them. A whisper in a club became a column in a weekly, became a flotilla of dinner table opinions. Affairs were described as understandings, and divorces required careful choreography in the courts, complete with staged hotel room discoveries that satisfied the paperwork. Portrait painters, seamstresses, and carriage drivers knew more than they ever said, which is the tried and true recipe for civilization. Everyone witnesses. No one insists if all of this seems a little contradictory, like a library that files. It's risk books under horticulture that is precisely the charm of the period. Their contradictions were elaborate yet functional, like the understructure of a great crinoline. Public duty and private wish learned to circulate in the same house without colliding. A father left for his club at 8. A mother wrote a letter with the ink barely dry. A daughter practiced scales. A son revised his Latin. The maid stirred. The coal. The dog sighed carefully. The clock on the mantel clicked each second politely into place. The language of flowers faded slowly with the century, not because people ceased to feel, but because they acquired other ways of saying it. Telephones arrived with their brusque rings, postcards with their public faces, bicycles with their cheerful disregard for chaperonage. Yet if you look at a surviving bouquet chart, with its grapes and myrtles and marigolds, you can still read a script for whispers. A pansy meant thought, a daisy, innocence, a tulip, declaration. It is both quaint and precise, like learning a lullaby in a language that nobody formally speaks and then humming it anyway. So the Victorians, behind their curtains, curated themselves. They organized secret lives with the care of museum keepers and then visited their galleries at reasonable hours. They worried about respectability, but they purchased perfume labeled from Paris. They praised chastity, but they wrote long letters. After midnight, they insisted on the moral betterment of the nation and then asked the bookseller if he had, the other edition. They were not hypocrites so much as they were ambitious architects of privacy. Privacy needed a floor plan, and they drew one. If you have made it this far without deciding to sleep, you have outlasted several archbishops and at least 3 etiquette manuals. But perhaps you are drifting as they drifted toward that peaceful place where an entire day's performances are folded up and put in a drawer. Imagine a small London room with a single coal still burning, an umbrella drying by the door, a bouquet in a narrow vase on the mantel. The flowers are ordinary, but they speak a patient dialect that anyone can learn, given time. The clock keeps its benevolent counting, Footsteps pass on the pavement and then recede, and somewhere, without hurry, a postman sorts tomorrow's letters. You might not think a ribbon-tied key laid on a velvet cushion could carry so much suspense, but in many Victorian houses it was a ceremony in miniature, the key to the bridal chamber, presented with a smile that said everything and nothing at all. People had a talent for rehearsed innocence. They embroidered the word felicity on sofa cushions and then tiptoed around it as if it might startle. The wedding day itself was a theater of starch and sugar. Rice, ribbons, orange blossoms, the cake with its hidden charms, thimbles for thrift, a button for neatness, the ring that promised, in quite an efficient way, more rings. After the guests went home, the orchestra in everyone's head kept playing the same quiet waltz. What now? Manuals waved a lace handkerchief at the question. Mothers pursued it obliquely while supervising the packing of trunks. Clergymen nodded to it from a distance, like men greeting a distant acquaintance across a square. Yet the key lay heavy on the cushion. It always did, if you're still with me by the time I get to window ventilation, which is a surprisingly central. Character tonight, you may subscribe if you wish, or blink in agreement and fall asleep midway through a sentence. Nothing here requires wakefulness. The past has arranged itself into padded furniture, and this particular furniture is the wedding night bed, a famous piece that everyone had seen at a respectful distance, and few had discussed out loud. The myths around that first night had a dense fabric, woven from medical solemnity and fairy tale. Dread. Young brides were cautioned that swooning was an option and smelling salts a remedy. Young grooms were advised to maintain an air of cheerful competence, a sort of amiable carpentry. The euphemisms were so layered that a pair could go from vows to nightshirt without meeting a straightforward verb. There were households where a matron had placed on the coverlet a tiny sprig of myrtle for fertility, which is a botanical way of saying good luck. And there were households where an older relative explained, with impeccable seriousness, that patience is a Christian virtue and also good for nerves. One can picture the mantle's portraits of serious ancestors, looking on as if marriage were a branch of municipal government. Expectations were exacting yet vague. Propriety demanded delicacy. Health demanded frankness. Reputation demanded both. At the same time, which is athletic. Advice literature handled this by recommending postponement. An anxious groom was to suggest a cup of cocoa, perhaps a story about childhood, and certainly a prayer. An anxious bride was to recommend sleep, as if dawn would arrive carrying detailed instructions in its pockets. In rural corners, older customs survived. A chaperone to the threshold, boots placed carefully together, or the folk idea that a shared cup of honeyed milk could sweeten not only the throat, but the hours. Practical solutions circulated too, discreetly. Lace that unfastened cleverly, night dresses with strategic tailoring, a candle placed where it would not misbehave. All of it tender and wary, and almost comically careful. The caution did not fade with sunrise. Victorian couples collected anxieties the way they collected antimacassars for armchairs in matching sets. The great moral wind of the age was forever discovering new drafts to stop. Too much excitement drained the constitution, warned some doctors. Too little endangered harmony, warned others. Regularity was praised with the kind of zeal usually reserved for bookkeeping. Breakfast at 9, carriage at 2, a sensible walk, a sensible conversation, and in the evening a sensible, well-ventilated room. Window ventilation was indeed a star. One guide earnestly explained that stale air led to poor temper and poor. Temper led to the decline of civilization, which is a heavy burden for a sash to bear. Letters show that many couples did what people usually do. They figured it out at human speed, with humor and apologies, and then kept a dignified silence about success. Silence frayed, however, at the edges where fear and arithmetic met. Children. were a joy, yes, and a budget line. The question of how many and how often pressed on households like a new tax. So contraception, though rarely named with that crisp modern word, lived a double life under softer phrases: precaution, hygiene, prudence, spacing. Apothecaries stocked rubber goods and plain wrappers after vulcanized rubber made them practical. Publishers offered pamphlets speaking in the patient tone of health. The most notorious of these, a little book that promised marriage philosophy, was tried in court for obscenity, defended in the name of public good, and sold out by lunchtime. The phrases are familiar even now: protection for the mother, harmony for the home, and the public interest in preventing poverty. The counterphrases are also familiar: threats to virtue, corruption of youth, and the slippery slope, which, if mapped accurately, would make a fine street atlas stop much of the debate, resembled a duel fought with stationery. Reformers mailed circulars. Officials mailed summonses. Juries mailed verdicts back to newspapers. Newspapers mailed editorials to breakfast tables where marmalade did its best to remain neutral. Underneath the legal punctuation, people made practical choices. Sponges were recommended in whispers. Withdrawal was praised by the thrifty and cursed by the unlucky. Douches were proposed with confidence larger than their results. And there was, as there always is, negotiation that belonged to no printed page. The more earnest the sermon, the more quietly a couple might fold a leaflet and place it in a drawer, beside a sealed packet and a string-tied notebook of household accounts. A marriage, like a shop, required inventory. Medical voices arrived in variegated tones. Some physicians were guardians of delicacy, armed with Latin. Others wrote as if they were building railways across a marsh and would not be deterred by sentiment. William Acton, grave and certain, announced that respectable women felt less desire than men, a sentence that has the bright confidence of a new umbrella and just about as much warranty in the rain. George Drysdale wrote a doorstop of a book, arguing for sexual science as social science, mixing physiology, economics, and the kind of utilitarian hope that believes history is a ledger with honest columns. Meanwhile, the public continued to buy an older favorite, Aristotle's masterpiece, written 2 centuries earlier and about as Aristotelian as a teapot, but filled with woodcuts, advice, and a tone of ageless authority. It was a publishing industry powered by blushes. Manuals did their solemn best to transform anatomy into etiquette. They applauded restraint, recommended cold baths for nerves, and prescribed the outdoors the way a fashionable aunt prescribes a change of wallpaper. Some were alarmed by solitary habits and blamed them for everything from pallor to poetry. Others warned of excitability, a diagnosis so generous you could fit most of adolescence under it. A few books aimed at wives, in careful prose, suggested that comfort and conversation mattered, which sounds obvious to us and was quietly radical then. The diagrams were modest, the indexes were ambitious. The chapter titles read like minutes from a kindly counsel, on temperance, on prudence, on the due consideration of one's partner. The effect is stupefying and somehow sweet. What is striking, in the sleepy way that a clock is striking only if you listen for it, is how many of these texts share a belief in progress by small steps. Don't hurry, don't frighten, don't boast, air the room, air the mind. Choose supper that will not trouble dreams. Happiness is a garden path, not a railway timetable. You can hear, faintly, the rhythm of ordinary evenings, the poker adjusting the coal, the soft click of a latch, the prudent snuffing of a candle. The city outside had its dramas, but most homes preferred the minor key dot, of course, life ignored. The neatness. Babies arrived early or late. Fears flew away on laughter or stayed and learned to make tea. Some couples found in each other exactly what the manuals never named, and so stopped reading. Others leaned on practical kin, the ones who sent a basket of broth and a note that began, "Don't be alarmed." The timid became less so, and the bold learned a new shyness that turned out to be a kind of courtesy. Where religion was strong, conscience patterned the weak like lace on cuffs. Where skepticism was strong, affection did the same work without the sermons. The real guidebook, the one never printed, was written in shared errands and shared jokes and the astonishing diplomacy of deciding who would get up to check the mysterious noise in the scullery, even the law's sternness softened by contact. With reality, judges continued to pronounce on obscene publications while clerks in their offices kept the forms for registering births in a neat stack. Policemen confiscated a parcel of rubber sheaths at a railway platform and then went home, to houses where their wives exchanged information with neighbors at backyard lines of drying laundry. This is not hypocrisy, it is choreography. A society learns its steps, a turn toward propriety, a pause, a bow to prudence, a small slide toward mercy. And over hundreds of evenings, the pattern becomes comfortable, like the indent a favorite book leaves in a cushion. You can almost draw a floor plan of a newlywed terrace house from these sources. The front room contains the wedding presents and the books that belong on display. The back room contains the armchair where serious conversations happen over tea. The little kitchen contains recipes for soups labeled restorative. Upstairs, there is the drawer with the leaflet that changed the household arithmetic from 4 children to 3, or from 3 to 2, and the window that opens because a doctor in print once declared the open window civilization's best friend. On the landing is the trusted broom that rescues letters fallen behind a chest. In the bedroom, the heavy curtains do their evening duty, and a small vase holds myrtle that pretends to be botanical when it is really aspirational. The myths, the fears, the expectations, the controversies, the manuals, each was a sort of lullaby. In stiff clothing, they aimed to quiet uncertainty, even when they produced it. If you have drifted while we drifted, that is perfectly in period. The era was very good at drifting with intention. It set a lamp in the hall, it discouraged drafts, it recommended cocoa, and it believed that night could be trained to behave. We can leave our couple there, in that ventilated room of sensible affection, where the key rests quietly in a dish, and the future has chosen, for the moment to arrive in slow, polite increments, like the postman the following morning, tapping twice and smiling. You might not expect a potted aspidistra to lead a double life, but in many respectable Victorian parlors, the plant understood secrecy better than most people in the room. It stood there with broad, glossy leaves and the quiet confidence of something that cannot wilt because propriety wouldn't allow it. Visitors came in at the proper hour, deposited their calling cards with the precision of stamp collectors, and admired the antimacassars crocheted like snowflakes that had learned self-discipline. Coal fires were blacked to a gentleman's sheen. Mantel clocks cleared their throats every quarter hour, reminding the household that time itself had manners. If a guest's gaze drifted, it's all watercolors of mild mountains, a sampler promising industry, and perhaps a glass dome protecting a wax orange blossom from the dangerous air. Everything was correct, and yet the front door kept a second rhythm, a private heartbeat, for parcels that arrived when no one was supposed to be looking, for newspapers folded so that certain columns faced inward, for music scores that slid, into the piano stool with the shy speed of swimmers disappearing under calm water. If you're still awake when we reach the part about the proper laundering of antimacassars, and I promise we will, because thread count is destiny, feel free to subscribe, or simply let the idea drift by like soot that has decided to behave. Nothing here is urgent. Even the doorbell rings politely. By day, the middle-class house was museum and manifesto. The brass plate outside shone with the effort of a career. Curtains negotiated sunlight into respectful portions. A parlor maid, aware that respectability begins with the angle of a brush, ushered callers into a room smelling faintly of beeswax and careful pride. Conversation moved along rails. One discussed the new sewer, which was an exciting topic rendered extremely calm by Latin names. One admired a cousin's photographs, which looked like small, obedient ghosts. One mentioned the music hall in a tone that suggested one had heard of it in a footnote. The piano was a diplomatic instrument. On top rested moderate sheet music. Home Sweet Home, a waltz not considered suspicious, while tucked beneath were the brisker tunes that encouraged elbows and eyebrows. Behind the framed portrait of a solemn uncle, there might be a folded playbill from a comic opera that everyone agreed was terribly vulgar and unexpectedly catchy. Respectability had drawers, it also had keys. The back of the house told the rest of the story with a whisper. Bell pulls, those embroidered nerves of the middle-class body, connected the parlor's calm to the kitchen's steady commotion. Here, the double life became logistics. A parcel from Holywell Street might arrive wrapped in brown paper, addressed as stationery, and be transferred swiftly from servant hands to desk drawer with a thank you and an understanding that wages arrive on time when discretion arrives first. Circulating libraries, those emporiums of mild rebellion, provided sensation novels under covers that looked like sermons. A book's respectable jacket could be slipped over something livelier the way a person slips into Sunday voice. Even the family Bible occasionally acquired a bookmark that led not to Ecclesiastes, but to the advertisement pages at the back where one could learn helpful things about corsetry, complexion, and certain rubber articles that the printer preferred not to specify. Stiff language is very useful for bending around meaning. Everyone, it seems, had a small hobby of secrecy. Gentlemen collected seashells, postage stamps, and opinions they would only admit to over a late cocoa. Ladies perfected handwriting that could glide past the eyes of a curious relative and look like nothing at all. The penny post became an accomplice after 1840, with envelopes that sealed themselves like shut mouths. Households discovered that the postman was an excellent listener, mostly because he did not listen. He merely visited. Love affairs, political societies, poetry contests, and purchases that made the dresser drawer bristle with new confidence, all traveled under the sovereignty of the stamp. One woman wrote to a friend that she had ordered a French hair tonic. The tonic arrived with a pamphlet explaining many other uses, which the letter politely did not describe. The safest way to transmit the unsayable was to drown it in instruction. Out in the shop-lined streets, the double life continued in daylight as if nothing were happening. A draper's counter supported yards of chased calico, and also catalogs of underthings that implied the human body in a tone of architectural interest. Haberdashers sold gloves that fit as closely as confessions a gentleman might step into. A tobacconist and emerge with a packet of cigarette cards that included actresses peering over fans with the practiced expression of people who knew that cameras ate modesty like biscuits. The stereoscope, that respectable household toy, brought living rooms the miracle of depth. And if a card subject happened to be a Roman statue whose drapery had become forgetful, the viewer could always claim they were interested in marble. The magic was not sin. The magic was distance, which is almost the same as innocence when arranged correctly. Evenings unrolled like ribbons. After a day of proper occupation, the family might stroll to the park and watch the swans performing. Moral instruction and buoyancy, or they might, with a faint air of research, attend a temperance lecture that described the evils of the gin palace, so meticulously that one came away with a rather precise address. People joined clubs for improvement and then discussed the music. Hall and tones of ethnography. Consider the smoking concert, that stalwart citizen of the male calendar, where songs were sung with just enough mischief to keep dentures alert and just enough respectability to let the last train be caught. A gentleman could sing a comic ballad that suggested, without stating, that a certain landlady kept a flexible book of rules. The audience laughed in a quietly merry way. Late-night dining rooms served oysters with a seriousness that expelled scandal from the premises, and yet the small glass of stout nearby knew exactly what it was doing. Sundays were the hinge that let the double life swing both ways. Church pews filled with families arranged in moral topiary, crisp, upright, a little ornamental. The sermon marched past like a careful column of ants. Afterwards, the same people met the same people on the same gravel paths, praising virtue and the weather in the same tone, while newsboys sold papers folded to conceal an article about something that had happened at a railway hotel. Respectable readers unfolded the paper at home where the aspidistra stood guard, read the article with furrowed sorrow, and place the paper away as if it might hiss. On Monday, accountants added columns of figures while humming a refrain learned at the music hall and forgetting quite responsibly where they had learned it. Seaside excursions gave the double life an unbuttoned cardigan. The railway whistle, a permissive cousin of the church bell, promised that geography could be character's alibi. Families went to Brighton or Blackpool where the air was described as bracing and the confectionery as braced. Bathing machines enforced modesty with such enthusiastic engineering that they became faintly comic. Rooms on wheels that marched into the water like disciplined livestock. Men and women changed behind. Plank walls and emerged as if reproduced by a careful printer. Between wholesome promenades, there were souvenirs that winked, novelty mugs, naughty peep show toys hidden in respectable shelves. Photographs where exposure and exposure flirted with each other under the pier. You could buy a picture with more ankle than usual and say you appreciated the foamy realism of the waves. You would not be entirely lying. Back home, the moral police patrolled with paperwork. Societies for the suppression of this and that wrote letters in triplicate. Theaters learned which jokes could pass without a blue pencil. Publishers, like men wearing tight collars, breathed cautiously, especially after the trial of an unfortunate book that had confused frankness with circulation figures. Respectable households agreed with the spirit of these efforts, while quietly noting that the spirit and the letter did not always sit in the same chair. Magistrates thundered. Printers adjusted. Booksellers discovered that the drawer with the lock was excellent for both dangerous literature and receipts. The city and its citizens evolved a choreography. Outrage in public, curiosity in private, and between a country of nods, coughs, and cleared throats where human nature could stretch its legs without taking off its boots. Gossip performed a kind of neighborhood governance as delicate as crochet. Net curtains, the national emblem of "we are not watching," filtered information into digestible light. A respectable woman would remark that Mrs. So-and-so's new hat was very youthful. Everyone understood that youthfulness was not the point of the hat. A respectable man would say he had attended a lecture on health. Everyone understood that the lecturer had taken questions from the floor with remarkable stamina. Rumor, traveling at the speed of laundry across lines and backyards, kept balance better than the official scale. When scandal grew too hot, it was placed to cool on an upstairs, landing like a pie. Most of it, like most pies, was entirely ordinary by morning. The domestic technologies of privacy multiplied. Locks and latches learned to click with decorum. Writing desks developed secret compartments that were not a secret to anyone who read furniture catalogs. Gaslighting acquired the delicate art of the half-turn. Photographic albums employed velvet clasps, as if the faces inside might wander off to parties if not restrained. The household safe, entirely dull in appearance, became temple and confessional for documents relating to mortgages, birth certificates, and, in some cases, dry little contracts that arranged the long afternoon of a clandestine affection. When disagreements happened, and they did, because people are weather, the safe also protected letters that would someday be destroyed with the conscientious ceremony usually reserved for expired insurance. In the end, the middle class double. Life was less a matter of sin than of staging. The front room presented a portrait. The back room stored the brushes and the little pot of color that lent the portrait its clarity. Respectability worked hard. It boiled sheets. It inventoried coal. It balanced ledgers with figures that had washed their hands. And yet it allowed people to enjoy a night out, a wrist postcard that could be tucked into a geography book, a novel that thumped the pulse, a private joke that lasted for decades. The same hands that turned hymn book pages also mastered the delicate fold that hid a theater ticket inside a glove. The same mouth that said, indeed, at a meeting could murmur, perhaps, under a street lamp. A life could be honest in sums and complicated in syllables. If you have drifted a little, that is precisely the correct behavior in this household. The aspidistra, heroic witness to every small secret, is still upright. The mantel clock at Modest Tyrant is announcing the quarter hour with the tenderness of someone tapping on the lid of a dozing teapot. The newspaper is folded just so. The stereoscope cards are back in their case. The safe door is closed. And somewhere a parcel wrapped as stationery waits for a calm afternoon. Respectability will answer the door tomorrow. Private life will take the back stairs. And both, with the perfect politeness of old neighbors, will nod to each other on the landing before the lamps are turned down and the house practices, for another night, the art of breathing quietly. You might not expect a tiny box of hairpins to hold so much ceremony, but on a Victorian wedding night, the real drama was in the small hardware. The last pin came out of the bride's veil with the reverence of a closing hymn, and everyone pretended not to notice that the pin cushion on the dressing table looked a little like a hedgehog that had learned about modesty. The parlor had done its duty earlier. Congratulations, time to teaspoons. A slice of bride cake that could have doubled as a paperweight, the loyal aspidistra approving from its pot, and now the house settled into the quiet after applause. Up the stairs, the best room had been warmed with a brass pan that wandered under the sheets like a moon on a leash. Gas jets were turned low with the soft click of respectability thinking better of itself. A nightshirt waited on the back of a chair, nervous but trying not to show it. The bed itself looked like an intention carved in mahogany. If you're still awake by the time we reach the part about the etiquette of untying boots, and yes, there was etiquette, feel free to subscribe, or simply lie there like a well-behaved bolster and let the rest drift past. The day had been long and thorough. Orange blossoms, which promised fertility with the confident logic of citrus, had crowned the bride into the late afternoon. Photographs were taken with that uniquely Victorian mixture of joy and self-control. No one smiled too, much as if happiness were a currency better banked than spent. The shoe was indeed thrown, though always as if by accident, as if a slipper had grown curious about physics and wandered out of the carriage window. Starch and satin had performed their duties with military bearing, and beneath all of it beat the quiet rhythm of expectation. Tonight would change the future in ways that laundry and ledgers could not fully account for, though laundry and ledgers would bravely try. The trousseau had been inventoried like a small empire chemises folded into diplomatic stacks, petticoats aligned like treaties, stockings coiled into tidy syllables, and the new initials on hand towels practiced looking habitual. Once door, bolts were drawn against the world. The room became a theater of objects. There was the water carafe under its crocheted cap, as if the glass needed a moral guardian. There were smelling salts within reach, because faintness had a courteous reputation. Slippers faced the bed like polite worshippers. On the table, a small vase held a last sprig of myrtle. Books waited, innocently titled Hints for Newly Married People, a prayer book, perhaps Mrs. Beaton's household management, which said nothing at all about this moment, and thereby lent it a strange authority. Advice had been gathered for months with the same seriousness used to collect teaspoons. Mothers offered recipes for a calm demeanor. Aunts recommended a warm bath. Friends, braver by letter than by speech, wrote phrases like gentle consideration and underlined them as if underlining were a medical instruction. The bride had heard that one should take a little soup, but not too much soup, lest the soup become a topic. The groom had learned that a gentleman's patience could be measured by how slowly he extinguished a candle. Across town, there were experts who aimed to make the candle unnecessary. Marriage guides promised to turn bewilderment into hygiene. Doctors in crisp prose advised rest, moderation, and fresh air that looked modest as it came through a cracked window. A much-quoted physician remarked, in the tone of a weather report, that many women were not terribly troubled by physical passion, which simplified matters while also reducing them to footnotes. Pamphlets, masquerading as medical tracts and sold. Under counters that understood discretion, offered diagrams with the certainty of railway maps. The language was very brave. It marched in Latin like a small army and managed to say almost nothing directly. The bride was encouraged to yield gradually, a phrase that sounded like a military retreat performed in silk. The groom was urged to be tender, which left him holding tenderness like a parcel without a return address. And hovering over every paragraph was the expectation of children, counted in advance by grandmothers who were already assessing christening gowns like meteorologists studying clouds. Meanwhile, myths walked in and hung up their hats. People believed that tight lacing had produced fragile ribs that might require careful negotiation. Consequently, the first act of many wedding nights was not a kiss but the careful unhooking of stays, a process that sounded like a practical examination set. To a quiet metronome, there were whispers that the hymeneal veil, the phrase itself was a curtain, really would produce proofs that polite households never requested and newspapers always hinted at. Stories traveled about a white sheet inspected like an exam paper. And yet in most middle-class homes, the laundry maid merely collected linen with the practiced indifference of one who measures life in starch. A rumor said that a bride should eat a bit of bride cake before bed to dream of future children. The more modern bride often dreamed only of removing the last hairpin without injury. Expectations were heavy, but they were neatly folded. The honeymoon itself had begun to change the choreography. Earlier customs of bedding the couple, with friends rattling doorknobs and singing, had retreated into folklore where they could embarrass fewer people. In their place came railway timetables. Many couples spent their first night in a carriage lit by lamps that made everyone look a little seasick, or in a provincial hotel where the bell-pull curtsied for hot water while the landlady performed. Discretion like a profession. The phrase honeymoon suggested sweetness and duration, but in practice it often meant damp seaside weather, new boots that pinched, and eggs served whenever one was not looking for eggs. Yet these trains and guest houses had their uses. They wrapped novelty around anxiety and gave the practical mind something to count. Mileposts go by at precisely the rate one needs to breathe. Back in the bedroom, ceremony helped. The groom's boots had to be removed because boots on a bed were an act against civilization. The act of untying, which sounds trivial, had become the night's first symbol. The not neat, stubborn, learned yielded to patience. Some couples laughed, some pretended not to. The bride's hair, having spent the day in architecture, sloped into geography. The mirror learned new manners and faced the wall. The small hearth ticked. The window carried distant city sounds under the sill like contraband late carriages. A dog declaring opinions. A group of friends walking home from a music hall, discussing the sketch with a policeman. The room obeyed none of it. This was a domestic ritual, performed at the speed of caution, with the improvisations of kind people. Advice manuals, for all their confidence, had been very certain about one thing. Tomorrow would be better, and the day after that ordinary. They were writing for the temperament of a century that loved to improve things by timetable. Avoid excess, they repeated, as if a person could measure their heart in teaspoons. Rise early, they added, which sounded like agricultural policy applied to marriage. They warned about the perils of nervous excitement in a tone that suggested furniture polish might help. Some recommended a light wine. Others banged a sober drum. Every instruction pointed to the same dream: domestic peace, a quiet breakfast, patient affection, an expanding family that would eventually pose for an anniversary, photograph in which everyone looked firmly related to the furniture. The expectations that hovered over the pillow were echoed by the accounts ledger downstairs. Marriage intertwined romance with arithmetic. There were bills from the dressmaker, folded like swans and equally proud. There were receipts for the new set of linen, in which the hem stitches were counted like rosary beads, 56 per inch here, 50 there because quality needed numbers. There was the wedding present from an uncle, a silver fish slice shaped like a declaration, which would not be useful for years but already weighed heavily on the sideboard. The future had been itemized with love, and now love had to sign for. It taught where fears crept in, they did so in practical clothes. More than passion, couples worried about ignorance, clumsiness, and the possibility of immediate parenthood, elbowing into the honeymoon like a well-meaning relative. The idea of spacing children existed mostly in careful hints tonics. Syringes, rhythms that followed the moon's phases as if the moon kept a notebook for each household. On certain pharmacy shelves between hair restorers and tooth, powders, little bottles made large promises with small print. Some couples read reviews of these items in the back pages of respectable journals that never admitted they were reviews. It was a polite marketplace of hope, as subdued as a whisper. Behind a fan, by the last match of the last candle, everyone understood that the century preferred solutions it could hide in a drawer. Yet in most rooms, the tidal pull of ordinary affection did the real work. Two people, exhausted by ceremony, discovered that conversation sounded different in night air. They talked about the cake that had refused to be sliced, the cousin who had arrived with a hat like a geography lesson, the cab horse that had decided to ponder existence at the exact moment a photograph was taken. They agreed that the new clock ticked too loudly. They noticed that the bell pull embroidered with daisies was charming. They promised to write thank you notes in a schedule as humane as possible. The dread of the unknown turned into the mild absurdity of now. If a moment was awkward, it could rest on the mantel beside all the other household ornaments and gather respectable dust. Mourning belonged to the housemaid and her quiet theology of order. She took away the ewer and replaced it with water that had opinions about temperature. She folded the night into the laundry with the same compassion she gave to everyone's nights. Sheets, once aspirational, became damp fabric steaming in the scullery. Public meaning evaporated into the hiss of an iron. The breakfast tray arrived with an honest omelette, little pots, and a triangle of toast that made a sincere effort. Newspapers appeared with their respectable faces. Inside, somewhere past the shipping news, was a small column deploring some scandal at a music hall, which the couple agreed was a pity, while also noticing where the music hall was. Thank you letters were drafted with a patience that astonished even patience. The bouquet began to think about pressing. The veil hung by the wardrobe, gently forgetting its job that by afternoon, the world resumed its responsibilities. The bride practiced the signature that would accompany bills, parcels, and the occasional sturdy petition. The groom inspected the New card engraved with his address and the words, by appointment, to no one in particular. A neighbor sent a pie. Another neighbor, less artistic, sent advice. The couple took a cautious walk, discovering that married weather felt exactly like unmarried weather, with the addition of an umbrella that made sharing into policy. Somewhere a child shouted, and the sound threaded into their future like a stitched dot in the weeks that followed. The wedding night turned into anecdote and then into furniture. The mahogany bed accepted the honest traffic of sleep, colds, novels, read too late, and the occasional calamity of a breakfast cup knocked over. The brass warming pan remained an argument about whether it belonged on a wall. The advice manuals retreated to a shelf where they frightened no one, and all the myth sheets, proofs, fainting, miraculous tonics thinned like fog. What remained was the deliberate practice of domestic kindness, which, to the Victorians, was the most respectable excitement of all. If you were drifting, you were doing it correctly. The gaslight is barely a thought. The pins have returned to their cushion like a flock that knows the way home. Outside the window, the street hushes its wheels over wet cobbles. The wedding cake drowses under its tin, dreaming of being sliced. With a decisive violin of a knife, the last match, used and satisfied, lies in the tray. Two pairs of slippers lean toward each other as if discussing breakfast. And the house, which has learned a new habit without making a fuss, breathes in and out slowly like a respectable creature asleep on its very best rub. You might not expect a quiet glass jar on a chemist's shelf to hold a national debate, but in Victorian Britain, the jar did its work politely, full of innocent-looking sponges. The bell above the shop door made a modest sound, the kind of chime that apologized for existing, and the proprietor kept his spectacles low on his nose in a way that suggested he knew everything and intended to share none of it. The window displayed toothbrushes, hair tonics, liver pills, and, if you looked very carefully, an arrangement of hygienic items that always faced slightly away from the street, as if the objects themselves were blushing. People came for cough mixtures and left with questions they communicated by clearing their throats twice. Euphemism had a busy job. Condoms were French letters or marriage sheaths. Pessaries were uterine supports, and syringes for postcoital. Douching hid under the alias female syringes, which told you just enough to be useless. The entire business of not having a baby yet moved like a whisper from drawer to drawer. If you're still awake by the time we reach the lemon half and the blue ribbon, and we will feel free to subscribe, or simply let your eyelids practice. Prudential restraint. The century had its reasons for whispering. Children were a blessing. They also wore shoes, ate bread, and developed opinions about schooling that came in invoices. Families read rent receipts like weather forecasts. A bricklayer with 6 children dreamed of 7 wages and discovered only 1. A seamstress added up buttons and realized mathematics rarely delivered mercy. Moralists described large families as patriotic banners. Midwives described them as a timetable of exhaustion. So people began to space births in that polite Victorian way, with diaries, with caution, with a feeling that they were doing something a little modern and a little secret, like owning a corkscrew shaped like a dolphin. Advice circulated in kitchens and parlors, traveling with teacups. One method required nothing more than self-control and a good memory. Another required a visit to a chemist who claimed to sell nothing controversial and then wrapped controversy in brown paper with admirable speed. The most antique method was older than parlors, withdrawal, delicate in practice and robust in footnotes. Manuals referred to it as interrupted Congress, which sounded like a parliamentary crisis conducted under blankets. It was free, required no postage, and came with reviews that were either very enthusiastic or very disappointed, sometimes in the same diary entry. More creative households experimented with the calendar, studying the moon as if it kept a sensible office. They counted days and hoped the body kept the same ledger. The body, being human, sometimes forgot to initial the margins. Douching promised swift correction vinegar, alum, quinine, all the flavors of caution, but the timing was precise and the plumbing uncooperative. And the results belonged to the category marked optimistic. Condoms, when they wandered into the story, did so with a flourish. Before rubber, there were sheaths made from animal membrane, surprisingly elegant, sometimes hand-sewn, sometimes tied on with a ribbon that had the audacity to be blue. Could be washed, dried by the fire like small humility flags, and reused until they retired from service. After vulcanized rubber arrived, the product thickened heroically. The earliest rubber sheaths were durable enough to make a tent consider its career options. They came with seams, with little ties, with paper packets covered in words that spoke in circles for the prevention of certain diseases and for married gentlemen. They were also sold by traveling salesmen who arrived with cases. That clicked, and by postal order under a different name, as if the parcel were shy. In certain shops, the polite code was to ask for gloves, and in others, the code was to ask for a particular brand of hair oil. The fact that a man could buy one in daylight without being arrested felt both wildly modern and thoroughly awkward, the way one feels when meeting a future appliance for the first time. Women, meanwhile, kept the sponge as a stubborn ally. Small C sponge, trimmed into a tidy oval, soaked in vinegar or quinine solution, and tucked into place with the seriousness of a key being turned. This was a method praised by some midwives and despised by some doctors. It required planning, privacy, and a confidence in pantry ingredients. In a few homes, an enterprising citrus fruit joined the conversation, a lemon half, soft scooped and worn as a makeshift cap, which sounds like a joke until one considers the genuine effort of an age working with what it could acquire for a penny. There were cocoa butter suppositories that behaved differently on warm nights, and little waxy tablets that promised results in exquisitely tidy handwriting. A brass syringe hid in a drawer between the glove stretcher and the moral courage. None of it looked like revolution. It looked like housekeeping, because that is how revolution often behaves when it wants to pass as ordinary. All of this happened under the polite gaze of science, which was slowly improving, but not always on the subject you needed after supper. Fertility was still measured by folklore. Some doctors, stern and certain, assured their readers that female passion was rare, and that conception preferred quiet women, which must have been a comfort to quiet women and an administrative challenge to everyone else. Breastfeeding was thought to discourage pregnancy, though the calendar argued back with the tenacity of statistics. The word spermicide existed in technical journals with a bravery that would have frightened anyone at tea. People who wanted smaller families performed experiments at the speed of courtesy, which is to say slowly, and learned from their neighbors in the sacrament of half-sentence, behind the counterpoint of caution, their breath the base note of controversy. The Obscene Publications Act arrived in 1857 and announced that information was dangerous if packaged with too much frankness. The law was described as a moral shield and used as a broom. It swept pamphlets into court with admirable efficiency, yet books kept returning. Small volumes slipped into pockets with titles that pretended to be botany, advice masqueraded as anatomy, recipes for prevention hid behind recipes for soup. A thin American pamphlet with the housekeeping title Fruits of Philosophy sailed across the Atlantic and straight into an English courtroom when an atheist publisher and a reformer named Annie decided the public might benefit from plain speech. The trial filled newspapers with careful circumlocution. The jury considered anatomy as if it were a social call. Copies of the book multiplied, as forbidden things politely do. And the Malthusian League acquired a membership list that read like a guest book for people who preferred smaller, christening cakes. Periodicals debated with their usual thunder. Some predicted national doom, too few babies, too much egoism, the collapse of manliness, and the end of empire, which is a great deal to ask of a sponge. Others, more domestic in tone, argued that mothers were not machines and fathers were not pauper generators, and that prudence might be a civic virtue if one simply changed the typeface. Women's journals printed letters signed a matron or truth, in which readers described exhaustion with calm grammar. Doctors wrote replies that used Latin where sympathy might have worked, but they learned slowly. The conversation moved between fear and arithmetic. Birth rates began to fall in the last decades of the century. The census learned to count pauses. In the ledgers of grocers and drapers, there were fewer notations for baby shoes and more for school copybooks. Reformers pointed to those columns and smiled carefully. Chemists found themselves running a theater of discretion. They stocked rubber goods, a phrase that sounded as if it were apologizing for itself, and they placed them near the back with the barometers. Customers used code. A little something for the liver, said one. A sheath for the thermometer, said another. And both parties agreed that thermometers were unusual outfits these days. Boxes traveled by postmarked surgical appliances, which satisfied the law and confused the postman. A respectable gentleman might purchase a marital sheath along with eucalyptus lozenges, and then discuss the weather for longer than necessary. Shopkeepers learned to wrap square packages as if squareness were a secret. Midwives learned which brands worked, which valves failed, which instructions were written by an optimist. Whole skills developed under the tablecloth of everyday life. The art of asking without asking. The practice of selling without saying. The relief of leaving with the right thing in the wrong paper at home. The conversation became a domestic craft. A wife who had rocked 3 infants knew the mathematics of naps. She could calculate the weight of quiet. A husband who had watched his wage vanish into porridge understood that love required inventories as well as vows. Together they negotiated. Sabbaths of the body. They discovered that not tonight could be a compound of affection and strategy, and that holding hands on the sofa while the fire performed its excellent impression of permanence was a perfectly respectable use of evening. On a sideboard next to the tureen inherited from Aunt Prudence, a discreet drawer gained a new purpose. Inside lay a packet of thick sheaths that smelled faintly of factories. A little bottle of solution with a label that fluttered between pharmacopoeia and poetry, and a folded leaflet that advised rinsing with the same seriousness it advised gratitude. If a visiting cousin borrowed the drawer for teaspoons, there was a choreography of small interventions, like a waltz and slippers. Moral panic visited in the press, but rarely stayed for tea. In the kitchen, most choices were practical rather than ideological. Spacing births meant fewer christening gowns to iron at once, and more time to repair the sole of a little boot before. It surrendered completely. It meant a mother could keep her own teeth longer, which midwives noticed even when they did not take notes. It meant the cradle could spend a season as a home for folded blankets without anyone accusing the blankets of sedition. And for husbands it meant discovering, sometimes with delight and sometimes with relief, that affection could be measured in soups and walks and stories at the edge of a child's bed, not only in the proud arithmetic of names added to the family Bible. The state had an opinion. The household had a budget. The household's opinion, usually won by simply being present every morning when controversy swelled again, as it periodically did. Like a municipal band rehearsing in a square campaigners for purity warned of race suicide, a phrase that sounded at once operatic and clumsy. Clergymen preached about duty with the weight of stone behind them. Reformers replied with patient statistics and a thin smile. The debate might rage in Parliament, but in a two-room flat, the decision rested on whether there was space for another cradle that winter, and whether the older child's cough would behave. Even those who condemned artificial precautions recommended continence, which was a long word for walking more often and going to bed a little earlier. Perhaps with Mrs. Gaskell, the century learned to make room for contradiction, a loud sermon followed by a quiet purchase, a published denunciation followed by a private kindness. Human beings do not move in one direction, they potter. Policy thundered. Drawers clicked shut. Meanwhile, the products improved. Rubber became thinner and more cooperative. Valves behaved. A few manufacturers added little emblems to the packaging, like anchors and stars, as if borrowing trust from the night sky. Instructions addressed themselves to married persons, and everyone agreed to keep a straight face. In back pages of respectable catalogs, between household scales and patent, mousetraps, tiny text offered matrimonial preventives with a promise of safety and comfort. The sentences were so tidy they practically curtsied. That formality, that little dance of embarrassment, became part of the charm for some and the irritation for others. But it worked well enough. Numbers and registers moved. Midwives saw fewer mothers on the edge of collapse. And the nation, which worried professionally, found something else to worry about by Thursday. In the private record of the century, the diaries, the margin notes, the folded letters saved by accident. One meets caution rendered as love. A husband writes that he has procured the necessary and adds that the chemist was kind. A wife notes that she is taking care and slept well. Another mentions a little sponge and the lemon that gave itself nobly to science. There's very little scandal in these pages. There is only the steady attempt to match desire to daylight. In the morning, the same couples argued about tea bags, repaired a chair, laughed at a child's pronunciation of hippopotamus, worried about coal, and reminded each other to bring home onions. The packet in the drawer contributed to these activities, not by announcing itself, but by allowing them to continue. And so the century practiced its quiet arithmetic of prevention, caution balanced by curiosity, controversy padded by cotton wool. It did not always succeed. It did not always fail. It learned the way people learn to make soup, by tasting and adjusting, by listening to those who have stood longer by the stove. Temptations to panic were resisted mostly by sleep. Tonight, somewhere in a rented room, a drawer closes softly on its small collection of rubber and ribbon. A clock breathes. A kettle hums. Two people decide tomorrow's errands and consider the weather with the seriousness it deserves. The jar in the chemist's window turns its face a little farther toward the street, almost brave. And the city, patient and busy, files away another evening in which nothing terrible happened and quite a lot of ordinary goodness did, quietly under the label of common sense. You might not expect a book to blush, but the early Victorian sex manual did its best. It wore a plain cloth cover, usually brown, the exact shade of a loaf that has decided to be respectable. The title pretended to be about hygiene or domestic, physiology, and the author often signed with a name that sounded like a trustworthy teapot. Inside, however, were diagrams in faint ink, modest to the point of invisibility, and sentences that circled the subject with the patience of a park. Path. If you're still awake by the time we reach the index of synonyms for marital congress, you may subscribe or simply allow the eyelids to close at their own professional pace. The manuals were not written to excite. They were written to calm. They believed devoutly in the power of footnotes and lukewarm water. A typical copy arrived wrapped in brown paper, the universal costume of Victorian secrets. It might be purchased from a chemist with a glass case of thermometers, or by post from an address that advertised medical works for family use. Some titles had been wandering the island since the 17th century old masterpieces that attributed everything to humors and the moon, and sometimes to walnuts. Others claimed modernity, bristling with words like nervous and functional. A few were truly medical, written by men with hospital posts and a talent for Latin. Most were hybrids, part sermon, part pamphlet, part tour of the body, conducted by a guide who found the exhibits both beautiful and slightly alarming. They promised knowledge without indecency, which is rather like promising tea without wetness. Yet somehow they delivered it, page after scraped clean page. Opening. One was an event without drama. The paper made a soft rasp. There was often an errata slip, apologizing for a misprinted figure, which is the most Victorian piece of paper in history. The table of contents did not say what you hoped. It said of marriage duties and of generative hygiene and on the use of cold bathing, as if the bathtub were a shy participant in a larger plan. Diagrams appeared on tissue sheets that folded like sighs. The human form was outlined with such discretion that you could show it to a vicar, provided you both pretended it depicted a complicated potato. Margins contained small moral weather. Reports. Moderation is a jewel. Advised one. Another recommended cheerful conversation, which must have pleased printers, because cheerful conversation contains a great many letters. The authors loved rules. They preferred their advice like their collars, very stiff. Fresh air, but not too much. Meat, but not at supper. A mattress firm enough to encourage virtue in the spine. The phrase excessive venery wandered everywhere, sounding like a misbehaving fern. Readers were warned about wasted seed, a tragedy to which they gave a level of accounting attention usually reserved for shipping manifests. One manual noted that marital visits should be not more than once in 5 or 6 days, and then, as if it had heard itself, added the comforting phrase for persons in full vigor. Another advised couples to avoid late hours, overheated, rooms, and French novels, a list that reads like somebody's idea of fun. There were schedules, and post schedules, and repair schedules. The body became a railway timetable where pleasure was the express and morality, the station master who insisted on checking every ticket twice. Behind the starch, you could glimpse concern. The books were trying with genuine fussiness to protect people from fear. The first night of marriage, according to many pages, required not passion but patience, an approach resembling the assembly of a complicated wardrobe. There were sections on conversation, on kindness, on proceeding with the tranquility of a well-tuned pianoforte. A few writers, braver or perhaps simply sleepier, admitted that wives might experience desire. In the margin, a ghostly hand seemed to hover with smelling salts. Husbands were instructed to ask after comfort, in a tone free of urgency. The concept of consent floated through, sometimes clear as glass, sometimes wrapped in cotton wool, always connected to the idea that affection should move at the speed of breathing. If readers learned nothing else, they learned that the most erotic instrument in the room was probably the clock, with its patient tick and its reminder that time belongs to everybody. Medicine crouched in the corner, tiding. Doctors weighed in with theories about nerves, about hysteria, about the effects of heavy quilting on the future of civilization. Some argued that women were naturally modest in appetite, a hypothesis neatly disproved by nearly all of history, but printed anyway because ink is fearless. Others noticed that pleasure aids health, and then stared at their shoes for a paragraph. The language of vital energy marched around like a volunteer regiment, cheerful and vague. Cold baths were recommended with alarming enthusiasm, as were brisk walks and the complete avoidance of pickles. A reader who obeyed every instruction would have slept well simply from fatigue. One author solemnly advised that no vigorous embraces should occur on Thursdays owing to digestion. The footnote did not explain why digestion chose Thursday, which is perhaps the most Victorian thing about the footnote. The manuals tried to be scientific about happiness. They catalogued positions, without saying so, using elegant euphemism and furniture metaphors. The word posture did what heavy lifting it could. Pillows appeared often, as if pillows were an essential department in the Ministry of Joy. There were recommendations for breathing, for gentle timing, for the order of operations in the theater of the bed. The advice framed love as a craft, like joinery, where sanding prevents splinters and patience avoids crooked drawers. When the book spoke indirectly of climax, they leaned heavily on words like mutual, a term that stuck to the page with moral glue. Many paragraphs concluded with the phrase, and so forth, a soft little curtain that dropped right before anything interesting happened. Every now and then, an author burst into candor like a startled bird. A chapter would admit that many wives were ignorant because no one had spoken plainly. Another would note with mild astonishment that tenderness increased success more than endurance did, as if the writer had just discovered that water is wet. A physician who had seen unhappy couples in his consulting room would deviate from generalities to recommend learning, delicacy, and a sense of humor. He might even include a letter from a grateful reader who reported, with the discretion of an accountant, a recent improvement in the comfort and harmony of our union. It reads like a fireworks display conducted under a blanket. Booksellers kept the material in a kind of twilight. The law watched, sometimes with magnifying glasses. Manuals that leaned too frankly toward contraception attracted prosecutors who preferred the word obscene to the word useful. Titles about prevention avoided saying prevention. They murmured about spacing, about prudential principles, about domestic economy, which is an impressive phrase for a sponge. The celebrated case of a little pamphlet on family limitation, which sold more copies from the courtroom than it had from any bookstall, demonstrated the classic Victorian paradox. The quickest way to advertise a book was to forbid it. Manuals that kept their moral overcoats buttoned, emphasizing duty. Health and decency circulated freely, slipping into bedside drawers next to spectacles and a thimble. How did these books shape the bedroom? Gently, like a hand smoothing a wrinkled sheet. They gave couples a shared vocabulary, even if it was a vocabulary of euphemisms. They suggested that pleasure could be considerate and planned, not a storm, but a weather pattern. They made a case for hygiene and rest, which are unsung heroes of contentment. They also smuggled in a certain democratic spirit. A marriage was a partnership in which both parties counted, and counting both parties required listening. One manual, almost reckless, urged husbands to await the answer of affection. Another recommended that wives abandon fear and request what pleased them without shame, and then, startled by its own bravery, hastily added in fitting measure. The tone was always that of a well-bred aunt discussing upholstery, yet the effect was progress measured in inches that mattered. The books also did something accidental but useful. They made the subject boring. When a topic is wrapped in the calm fabric of diagrams and numbered paragraphs, it becomes manageable. A nervous bridegroom who could not ask his father a single question could ask the index, which answered in alphabetical order without blinking. A wife who had heard alarming folklore from cousins could replace superstition with a sentence on page 73 that sounded like washing directions. Warm, not hot, gentle, not rough, patient, not hurried. It could be a prescription for laundering lace or for learning the body. The dignity of the tone, even when misguided, reduced panic. Panic is loud. Instructions are quiet. Quiet wins most evenings. Of course, a great many pages were wrong. Some authors believed nonsense with a conviction that would later be repurposed by weather vanes. Yet even there, the manuals had an odd utility. They modeled the idea that love is improvable, that too, people can return to the same activity with more skill next week, as one returns to the piano, forgiving yesterday's mistakes and noticing a smoother scale. The emphasis on kindness, on rest, on shared comfort landed where it needed to land. Even the prohibition against French novels had a hidden compliment. It admitted that books can change what one wants at night. The manuals were simply offering alternatives. Read this book instead of that one. Follow this diagram instead of your imagination. Try the Thursday plan dot in small rooms. The influence looked practical. A couple placed the lamp with a softer shade because a chapter had said harsh light disturbed the nerves. They opened a window a few inches because a paragraph whispered about fresh air. They agreed to talk first because an index said conversation. 3 times in a row. The blanket was turned down, not like a curtain at the end of an opera, but like the cover of a notebook being opened. In the corner, a washstand waited with a jug that had seen more history than the furniture implied. The clock ticked. The bed springs remembered stories they would never tell. And 2 people, somewhat reassured by the knowledge that there was a section about everything, proceeded in the same slow, considerate way they would slice a loaf. Not too thick, not too thin, warm if possible. Publishers noticed the market and polished the product. Later editions added gilt on the spine, a small luxury that made the secret feel respectable. Some included question and answer chapters, imitating the style of the catechism, which somehow made physiology feel like memory. Work. What is the proper interval? It varies. What is the chief enemy of happiness? Haste. Even the typography participated. Italics leaned in to emphasize caution. Capitals appeared like chaperones. The overall effect read at 11 o'clock with slippers. By the hearth was that of being guided down a corridor by a competent but unadventurous butler. He knew where everything was. He did not comment on the wallpaper, and so the century learned its science of pleasure in the school of tidiness. Not from novels, though novels helped. Not from gossip, though gossip tried. But from thin books that believed the soul could be comforted by lowercase letters. The manuals did not invent tenderness, yet they gave it directions. They did not create desire, yet they taught it to knock softly and carry a handkerchief. They told couples to sleep, sometimes, which may be the best advice any manual ever gave. Somewhere a copy still rests on a shelf, the cloth faded to the color of tea that has waited too long. Inside, the tissue diagrams lie quiet as moth wings. A reader could open to any page, and the page would offer the same sleepy wisdom. Breathe. Be kind, allow time. The lamp hums, the kettle cools. The book closes with its prim little click, and the room settles into a silence that is not empty at all. You might not expect the width of a London gas lamp's glass chimney to matter very much to history, but on certain damp nights in the 1860s, it decided whether a pavement was bright enough for a constable to notice a hat feather, a wink, a lingering handshake, and a quick exchange of coins that paid for tea in the morning. We are in the slow, glistening half-light of Victorian London after dark, where puddles behaved like small lakes and boots nursed quiet grudges. The city was a quilt of districts and rules stitched together with soot. Soho preferred chatter. Holborn liked to keep its secrets folded. Whitechapel believed in long working hours for everyone, including its shadows. Even the river had a schedule, sliding in and out like a clerk who never forgot to tip his hat. The newspapers called these women by a dozen names, many of them mean, some of them almost botanical, like nymph of the pave, which makes the pavement sound like a polite pond. The city called them necessary and scandalous and many things. In between, depending on the time of day and whether the vicar was listening. If you're still awake when we reach the police form that asks, in 7 separate lines, whether a bonnet was trimmed with ribbon or with something more ambitious, you can subscribe, or you can simply let the lids relax like velvet curtains. In a well-heated parlor, before anything else, there were doorways. A doorway was a unit of economy. It offered shelter from drizzle and negotiation with the dignity of masonry. Brothels had doorways that learned many footsteps, from customers with careful gloves to inspectors who preferred to knock as if the wood had done them a personal injury. Streetwalkers favored doorways that faced gaslight, but not too directly, which is a very good description of Victorian morality. Many houses were not officially brothels at all, merely private lodgings with a habit. The landlady took her rent with the steady rhythm of a metronome. The constable took his notes in a hand that grew smaller as the page filled. There were terms of art. A dress lodger wore clothes on loan from a proprietress and paid for them with her labor, which moved the ledger numbers around like little boats in a basin. A rescue society circulated pamphlets as tender as sermons and as cold as statistics. Somewhere a bell rang for closing time at a public house, and London woke up slightly, the way a cat opens one eye and decides against action. The night was a bureaucracy of small decisions: where to stand, whom to greet, whether to keep the shawl up or down. Tiny acts of weather management met tiny acts of law. The geography of vice came with the street atlas of foods. Coffee stalls opened, like metal flowers at corners where the police rotated, offering cups that tasted faintly of tin and consolation. There were pies of questionable biography, cleverly arranged to look untroubled by history. Oyster sellers appeared with barrels that smelled of the sea under 20 miles of city, handing over briny encouragement with a wooden fork. A woman finishing her work might buy a heel of bread, half a herring, and as fortune smiled, a square. A chocolate that squeaked against the teeth. Gossip moved with the food. Who had moved houses? Who was trying a new hat style in St. James's that, rumor said, attracted better clients and more rain? Who had reported a beating and who had? Not because paperwork has its own climate. The slang varied by parish. In one place you could offer a turn and be understood. In another you might promise to walk out and discover it meant only a conversation long enough to finish a cup. If you think nothing could be more prosaic than a ledger, wait until you meet a London street vocabulary equally itemized, equally precise, and carried not in a book, but in a pocket of the mind. Inside the purpose-built houses, the ones that admitted their occupation with a blush of curtains and too much wallpaper, there was a choreography of ordinary tasks that would lull an insomniac into virtue. Candles had to be snuffed and replaced. Sheets laundered, boiled, and winched to the drying line with the seriousness of a naval exercise. Carpets beaten on Wednesdays because the neighbors had a pattern and polite houses respected. Patterns. The bell pulls were carefully mended, the parlors dusted, the spittoons emptied with the kind of stoicism usually awarded medals. There were keepsakes on mantels, shell boxes, brass figurines with nicked noses, a daguerreotype in which everyone looked solemn because holding an expression for that long is hard work. The madam, who had invented a new way to tie her keys, kept a notebook that listed days off, preferred callers, and a truly impressive number of entries labeled flowers, which was both literal and strategic. Men liked to bring bouquets, to justify the visit to themselves, as if lilies were passports. A house was a machine for converting time and linens into rent. Its romance lay in perfecting the mechanism beyond reproach. Doubt there were rules of attire that made the city look like a traveling exhibition. Boots were polished to a level that suggested the sky had fallen into the leather. Skirts were chosen for swish and for the ability to dry quickly near a hearth. Feathers were liked, but could be temperamental in fog, taking on the attitude of A damp cat. Gloves were necessary to signal politeness, which almost did the work of respect, but not quite. Jewelry fluctuated with the week's intake. Cameos on a good Tuesday, a modest ribbon on a Thursday that had behaved like an unwatered plant. Hairdressing could be as elaborate as a law report. There was a rumor that red ribbons signaled one thing and blue another, but the ribbons themselves denied everything and carried on being ribbons. Most women learn to read a man the way a seamstress reads cloth, by grain, by weight, by what it will and will not do. It was a practical wisdom, rarely rewarded with certificates, often rewarded with survival. The police kept notebooks dense enough to weigh a pocket down. Names assumed and otherwise, addresses definite and perhaps found with and observed. Nearer, all in an ink that looked permanently chilly. Officers assigned to moral duty walked beats that traced a shy geometry around theaters and music halls. Sometimes they arrested, sometimes they warned, sometimes they shrugged because winter demanded pragmatism. The contagious diseases acts hovered like drafts around door frames, temporarily empowering officials to compel examinations in certain towns. London itself stood apart from that regimen, but not from the debates it stirred. Doctors argued in journals with titles that sound heavy even when whispered. Clergymen preached. Parliamentarians declared the nation's virtue intact, and then woke their valets to find their slippers. Meanwhile, in back rooms, tinctures were brewed, some medicinal, some hopeful, some containing more pep than a regiment's band. A bottle, labeled for the nerves, could mean anything from lavender to afternoon sleep. Philanthropy arranged itself with neatness. Rescue homes operated on schedules that would comfort a train. Visitors rang a bell and encountered forms, which gathered details until the details felt tired. Many homes offered instruction in laundry, an art that Victorian society treated like a philosophy because it knew how to remove stains patiently. There were readings in the evening and porridge in the morning, and the kind of gentle rules that attempted to paper over loneliness with order. A handful of women returned to families. A handful married someone with a steady wage and a kind patience. Many, faced with the arithmetic of rent and bread, drifted back to the pavements that could be counted on. Reformers printed tracts with titles that sounded like long sighs. Some did good measured in blankets. Some did good measured in speeches. The city yawned and turned over. Economically, the trade sat on a small three-legged stool. Cash to survive today, credit to survive tomorrow, and hope to survive the rest. Landladies extended exactly as much credit as would guarantee a continued relationship with the laundress. Pawnbrokers operated like seasonal weather systems. On Mondays, the queue contained wedding rings that would be reclaimed on Saturdays, as if the week had merely been a philosophical misunderstanding. The coin most loved was the shilling because it combined usefulness with a pleasant clink. Banknotes were suspect after midnight. Everyone counted without appearing to count. Young men learned that tipping the coffee stall man improved one's reputation as much as polishing boots. The city's economy, from omnibus to oysters, benefited discreetly, a fact most citizens greeted with the silence, usually reserved for snow falling at an inconvenient time. Street strategies would make a naturalist proud. There were favored corners where the lamplight crouched just above eye level, creating a gilded anonymity. There were edge routes along parks where the gravel told you who approached, like a modest drum. Music hall exits were popular because laughter does something to money that sermons do not. The Fleet Street midnight crowd required its own approach, preferring wit about newspapers to any mention of romance. Women learned to spot the difference between a sailor paid that afternoon and a clerk paid last week by the tilt of a hat. They also learned, more importantly, to spot danger, which can hide in a dozen small gestures. A silence that tries too hard, a boot that pivots as if it has decided for a body. Friends looked for friends. They shared landmarks, meet by the coffee man who always wears a scarf like a lighthouse, and news traveled quickly when someone vanished. The city might forget by morning. The women tried not to. On Sundays, the whole enterprise held its breath. Churches made their bells do enthusiastic work. A few pews contained congregants from the nights before, thinking of quiet things, or simply enjoying heat produced without negotiation, and modest. Rooms' hair was unpinned and tried gently to be itself again. Socks were mended, a task that imitated philosophy by turning holes into continuities. Some women wrote home the kind of letter that mentions weather and omits biography. Others read penny romances in which heroines fainted stylishly and men apologized handsomely. The day softened edges. The city, given the chance, could almost pass for benign, like a dog that looks guilty but has actually done nothing wrong for an entire hour. There were famous cases, of course, when scandal inflated like a hot air balloon and the newspapers crowded around it with binoculars. Politicians were sometimes discovered to be citizens. Actors occasionally attempted privacy and found it unpopular. But most of the nights we are considering never made news at all. They existed in the sigh between one edition and the next, a commerce of glances and bargains and practicalities. The women aged as people do everywhere, by seasons, by worries, by the number of times hot water was carried upstairs in a bucket whose handle had decided to bite. Some saved enough to retire to a small shop that sold thread, which is an elegant ending because thread repairs things quietly. Some did not. London's memory kept them badly, storing a few names on the shelves of scandal and letting the rest be dust, which is a kind of injustice the city still commits with perfect regularity. If you step back far enough, the system looks like upholstery. Society stretched a fabric of rules over a flawed frame and patted it smooth. Everyone sat on it, and no one admitted the springs were doing their best against the laws of physics. Respectable people preferred not to know the names of streets. They actually knew very well. Policymakers preferred remedies that could be expressed as neat sentences. Moralists preferred to imagine sign happened in a different time zone. Meanwhile, in the small rooms, the kettle boiled, the basin filled. The shawl dried on a chair back, and sleep arrived by ordinary means. Even scandal, when examined closely, had a laundry list. So many shirts, so many cups, so many steps carried up and down narrow stairs. What remains, when you listen hard enough, is the sound of London breathing through its iron lungs of rail. And river. Somewhere a door clicks with a precision learned from habit. Somewhere a coin rings in a teacup. Somewhere a woman knots her hair and watches the street from a window that believes in rain. History, like the city, prefers small details. That hold still. The warmth of a coal scuttle, the exact tilt of a hat in a fog bank, the way a gas flame shivers when somebody opens a door. None of it is heroic. All of it is human. If the lamp glass is clean and the wick trimmed, the night seems almost friendly. The ledger closes for the week with its tidy figures that pretend to be simple. And the city, practiced in forgetting, loudly remembers softly the way a footprint lingers in sand you didn't notice you were watching, until even that, like the last note from a distant music hall, slips into the kind of silence that knows how to keep a secret. You might not expect a satin slipper to nudge the course of an empire, but in certain London drawing rooms, the curve of a shoe decided where a statesman stood, at least for an evening and sometimes for a vote. The Victorians liked to pretend. That desire wore a plain bonnet and stayed home, but it commuted. It attended the opera. It rented discreet townhouses with cheerful fireplaces and a preference for silk curtains that absorbed gossip better than wallpaper. Courtesans were the city's unofficial lecturers on taste. They taught lessons in posture and conversation, and how to laugh like a harp string being plucked by someone who knows the song. They learned the tiny math of glances and favors. A wink could buy flowers, a smile could buy furniture. A season's worth of carefully controlled charm could buy a small country's worth of roses, delivered weekly and not a single petal out of place. If you're still awake when we begin ranking the relative political influence of satin, taffeta, and file, you may subscribe out of polite curiosity or simply continue. Breathing slowly and imagine a lace fan opening at the speed of a yawn. The Knight's classroom was an opera box where the city came to be seen, pretending not to look. Opera glasses made everyone into minor surveyors, measuring distances that were not on any map. Courtesans mastered the art of being interesting without looking surprised by it. They had biographies that sounded like novels and day planners that sounded like campaigns. An evening began with a carriage that had memorized how to arrive 3 minutes after an ambassador and 2 minutes before a duke who disliked waiting. Bouquets acted as calling cards. Orchids meant please remember your promise. Gardenias meant I remember mine. Violets were innocent until proven otherwise. The great favorites could make a scandal look like interior decoration. They arranged rooms the way governments arrange committees, with soft chairs for allies and small tables for negotiations that needed somewhere to rest their elbows. The music downstairs rose and fell. Upstairs, a rumor about a cabinet appointment put on a velvet cape and practiced walking convincingly. Training for this world arrived from the most ordinary places: a father's library, a mother's sewing box, a childhood that taught how to read a room the way a governess reads a child's face. Wit was the real currency, and it spent well. There were conversational strategies as precise as chess openings. Ask a minister about railways, and he will reveal his soul, which turns out to be timetables. Compliment a banker on his handwriting, and he will describe the economy as if it were a new pen nib. Accept gifts the way cathedrals accept donations, gratefully, with good records and with a firm sense of how much a plaque costs. Money translated into independence, a word that looked excellent on a calling card even when unprinted. Diamonds were portable savings accounts with social ambitions. Pearls were statements of policy. Sables were winter's version of a seed. In the house, the best-known courtesans kept ledgers so tidy that accountants might have blushed. If a bouquet arrives on Friday, a thank you note departs on Saturday, and a reminder about the promised horse leaves quietly on Monday because horses respond best to calendars. Clothes formed a soft machine for manufacturing reputation. A dress might be cut to imply a scandal or deny one. Sometimes both at once, which is efficient. Colors campaigned for attention like candidates. A deep green said, I keep secrets. Crimson said, I enjoy keeping them. Ivory suggested the possibility of innocence in the same way a snowbank suggests the possibility of spring touch it, and you will find water. The famous beauties understood how light works. Gaslight forgives, candlelight flatters. Morning light tells the truth and must be met with tea. Hair became a portfolio, augmented with combs and jewels that were less ornaments than arguments. Perfume was memory in a bottle. A certain blend of violet and bergamot could sign a letter in the air, so that a statesman 20 years later might still recall a vote he pretended to cast on principle. Even their pets acquired symbolic duties. A well-behaved greyhound implied restraint. A Persian cat, however, implied an editorial stance on indolence, which was often misread deliberately. One hardly spoke of seduction. One spoke of conversation. The object was not conquest, but choreography. The room moved along a slow curve from introductions to confidences, each marked by a specific tilt of the head that could have been measured with a protractor. Had protractors enjoyed the theater? Food played a minor soothing role. Glazed fruit did important diplomatic service. Tea, poured at the correct temperature, argued for civilization more persuasively than a pamphlet. Wine whispered. Champagne made puns. Water, if offered at the right moment, saved reputations with the simplicity of a bucket. Letters happened after midnight, in handwriting that understood what it meant to be both personal and undeniable. Paper quality mattered. Envelopes learned discretion. Wax seals rehearsed. Being decisive with small, stamping gestures. Nothing so dangerous as persuasion felt dangerous at all. It felt like velvet and well-timed silence. Behind all this serenity hummed a practical engine. There were mortgages to pay, siblings to place in decent apprenticeships, laundresses to compensate, coachmen to keep at a precise level of loyalty and tip-induced cheerfulness. The famous mistresses were small businesses with music boxes. They employed hairdressers with opinions, dressmakers with memories, secretaries who could turn a promise into a paragraph that sounded like a compliment, and lawyers who specialized in avoiding litigation by inventing diplomacy. Some gave to hospitals, which made the newspapers polite. Some sponsored artists, which made dinner parties lively. At least one kept a collection of rare cookbooks and believed custard to be morally improving. With income came caprice, and with caprice came rules. No credit extended beyond the end of the season. No jewels accepted without an understanding about return, unless the jewel's donor had already repaid himself by boasting. Above all, no scandals that required arithmetic. The city could forgive many things. It grew stern when forced to calculate dot politics, found its way to the parlor with its hat in its hands. A rumor about a trade bill could be coaxed out of a reluctant gentleman, with no more effort than it takes to ask about the weather and listen not to the answer but to the pause. Patronage passed quietly through rooms that smelled of roses and warming bricks. An influential favorite might persuade a newspaper editor to invert a headline or a department to consider a cousin for a berth on a colonial steamer. It was not ideology, it was lubrication. Empires, like pianos, require tuning, and sometimes the note is found by a person who keeps a better ear than a prime minister. A bolstered budget might owe itself to a conversation that began with a compliment about lapels and continued with a remark about dockyards. A resignation might choose its date after a supper at which someone observed, with a kindness that sounded like a warning that fatigue looks poorly in the papers. Historians prefer large causes. The city remembered that dinner plans are causes of their own. The opera was a trading floor, where melody functioned as background music for negotiation. An opera box offered box seats to the economy of favor. As tenors attempted heroism, decisions about railways advanced at a civilized pace. As sopranos expired tastefully, a committee appointment revived mysteriously the next morning. Flowers, sent visibly, accompanied opinions, delivered invisibly. One could, with a placement of gloves and a nod during the interval, indicate that. The opposition's new policy on tariffs lacked charm. By the final chorus, a compact existed to reconsider charm's relevance to tariffs, which you may consider progress or the triumph of haberdashery, depending on whether you have ever revised. A policy after losing a button, the trick lay in letting everyone believe the idea was theirs. Courtesans were generous with ideas because ideas are not reducible by pawnbrokers, of course. There were scandals, labeled with names like storms because they made noise and toppled hats. A diary fell into the wrong hands. A painting became too recognizable. A gift horse, literally a horse, with opinions and oats was stabled at an address that encouraged questions. The city loved to moralize at breakfast and forget by dinner. Courtesans learned the geography of reputational. Shelter, Brighton for weather, Paris for disappearing, Scotland for marriages that should have been conversations. When disgrace threatened, charity improved rapidly. A donation to a foundling hospital acquired a halo so bright, even caricaturists winced. The contrast amused London because London adored contrasts in which it could star. A sermon thundered, a supper gleamed, a vote passed, and the newspapers folded themselves with a noise-like finality. Then the next season unrolled its carpets as if nothing had occurred, because nothing did, in the sense that all of it happened every year. Some women retired while still famous, which is to say with the good manners to leave a party while their flowers were fresh. They purchased cottages and developed obsessions with roses that required the attention of entire villages. Others married. Men who had never forgotten that intelligence in a drawing room is a dowry. A few wrote memoirs with titles that fossicked agreeably among indiscretions without pointing directly at them. The city pretended not to read these books and then loaned them widely. What survives are fragments, a fan in a museum whose label practices discretion, a ledger in which the word lace occurs with numbing regularity, a portrait whose subject's gaze appears to be assessing the viewer's prospects for improved posture. There are also streets that remember carriages and steps that remember where to pause before a laughter dot. It would be pleasant to say that seduction shaped history because love moved mountains. More accurately, rearranged furniture, it placed a chair near a window where a certain gentleman could think more clearly. It ensured the minutes of a meeting were written by someone whose spelling was better at midnight than at noon. It taught a generation of influential men to appreciate sentences that arrive softly and make their point without fuss. It popularized silk as a form of policy expression and argued through example for the civilizing effects of good tailoring. It altered budgets in small ways and occasionally large ones. If the scale of empires looks grand in hindsight, the levers were often delicate, a sigh, a silence, an eyebrow trained to converse in two dialects of irony. The art was not conquest but comfort. Make a man feel less foolish than the rest of the world, and he will imagine himself brave. Make him feel clever, and he will sign things. Toward the end of our long, drowsy tour, it becomes clear that the courtesan's real profession was attention. Attention to the angle of the lamp, the temperature of tea, the moment to introduce a topic, and the better moment to let it drift away like steam. Attention is labor, and it leaves traces. A line of pillows coaxed into civility, a scribble in a margin that saves someone from a grammatical misdemeanor, a clasp that fastens quickly because fingers have practiced. Cities run on such work and pretend they don't. A good hostess official or unofficial could reduce a quarrel to a matter of seating. A bad one could start a war over fish knives. The famous women were good at preventing bad dinners. This is no minor achievement. Many nations have come to grief through poor management of soup dot. If you listen, even now, you can hear the city settling back into its cushions. Gaslight breathes like a creature with excellent posture. Carriages forget the road and remember the stable. In a quiet room, a letter dries, its ink forming the neat, open loops of someone who has nothing left to prove. The slipper that allegedly nudged the empire rests on a hearthrug and considers itself unremarkable. Perhaps it always was. Influence, when it is graceful, looks like nothing at all. Just a fan unfolding, a sentence landing softly, a promise kept because it was written down next to order more violets and checked off with the same careful hand. The opera ends, and we cannot quite recall whether the tenor triumphed or merely persisted. It hardly matters. The real aria was in the intervals, where the city learned again that power sometimes wears perfume, counts change accurately, and leaves before the lights are fully up, so that, for a dreamy minute, the whole evening seems to have tidied itself away. You might not think a city could try to tidy desire with a notebook and a very serious hat, but London gave it a cautious attempt. The vice police walked slowly, because morality, like a cat, responds poorly to chasing. They were recognizable by the shine of their boots and the focused look of men counting things that do not wish to be counted doorways. Whispers, the number of minutes someone stood near a lamppost pretending to study the weather. Official language helped. A house was not a brothel until it was a disorderly house. And a woman was not a person with a complicated life until she was a common prostitute, a phrase that made the paperwork fit neatly into rows. There were forms for everything: complaints, cautions, raids, receipts for confiscated playing cards, all documented in handwriting that aspired to virtue. The city preferred its sins recorded in copperplate. If you're still awake when we reach, the exciting question of how many inches a constable's notebook protruded from a pocket before regulations intervened. Feel free to subscribe, or simply adjust your pillow and let the bureaucratic lullaby continue. A constable's evening began with his beat, which was not a musical term but a geography of boots. He learned the rhythm of streets the way a postman learns fences. Certain doors breathed in and out with visitors. Certain windows practiced looking innocent at speed. The vice police were expected to know the difference between a lodging house, a coffee room, and a place where introductions outran coffee by several lengths. They developed polite antennae. If a house had too many visitors who all greeted the maid as "my dear," it attracted conversation. If the curtains did not meet, it attracted a memorandum. Respectability loved symmetry. Suspicion adored asymmetry, such as a respectable breakfast room with 3 hat stands when only 2 appear necessary. Constables recorded these tiny architectural sermons and sent them uphill to inspectors who liked to draw diagrams in the margins. Nothing calms a moral panic like a well-labeled sketch of a staircase. Plainclothes joined the effort, bringing with them the great 19th century skill of looking like a slightly taller version of no one in particular. Undercover men visited music halls to determine whether the songs were too merry, a challenging assignment since merriness is not covered in the police orders and must be estimated by toe tapping. They watched public houses for improper solicitation, which sounds like a sermon, but usually meant a conversation that lasted 2 minutes too long. They frequented arcades whose gaslight treated everyone kindly, and they considered whether kindness itself was suspicious. They acquired informants, who preferred their names even more private than their lives. They learned where the pavement stones told Tailies corners where carriage wheels paused, steps scrubbed too diligently, door knockers warm even at odd hours. The city whispered to them mostly trivia. They wrote it down anyway. If all information were useful, statistics would sleep less soundly. The law offered a set of levers that looked more mechanical than moral. The Contagious Diseases Acts promised public health by allowing forced medical examinations of women. Suspected is such a portable word of selling sex in certain garrison towns and ports. London half admired the idea and half disapproved of the tone, which was brisk. Doctors examined, constables escorted, magistrates frowned, reformers sharpened pen nibs. The Act's paperwork produced ledgers like chili quilts, each square a life made meet. Women were registered, examined, detained, and released, often without the courtesy of certainty. Lock hospitals became part of the city's whispered map, places where statistics practiced their bedside manner. Opponents, led famously by Josephine Butler, argued that the Acts policed the poor woman's body while the gentleman's conscience enjoyed generous visiting hours. In meetings that lasted exactly as long as lamps allowed, they described privacy as a kind of dignity you can misplace. The Acts staggered under this attention and eventually retired, folding their forms with a rustle that sounded like apology. Brothel raids provided the occasional eventful evening in a profession otherwise devoted to standing. They were carefully staged like household dramas with more boots. An inspector knocked. Silence considered its options. Inside, doors that had been patient all winter suddenly developed athletic ambitions. The law did not require melodrama, but hinges often attempted it. Furniture behaved bravely. The official aim was less to catch people in the act than to catch a house in the habit. Evidence included ledgers with suspiciously floral entries, champagne at unconvincing hours, and passages where cupboards had learned to be social. Arrests followed, as did court appearances where a magistrate weighed the city's desire for order against the county's desire to avoid paying for it. Fines arrived like weather. Occasionally, a house earned the honor of being suppressed, a conclusion that required a polite crowd, a locksmith with opinions, and a municipal sense of destiny. The building sighed. The trade reassembled next door with improved curtains. The vice police did not work alone. Moral entrepreneurs, splendid phrase, offered help in the form of societies whose titles required deep breath, the Society for the Suppression of Vice, the National Vigilance Association, rescue homes that rescued with determined embroidery, and missions that handed out tracts composed primarily of commas and concern. Their volunteers, many in sensible hats that could withstand weather and awkward conversations, patrolled thoroughfares explaining to girls on the brink that the brink could wait until morning. They maintained shelters where tea was poured with, such steadiness that one felt absolved merely by holding the cup. Some groups campaigned for age of consent reforms and successfully moved numbers upward. Others concentrated on reading lists. A few took a statistical interest in the length of hemlines, although the data, when charted, stubbornly refused to correlate with anything except the climate. Bureaucracy makes a soothing sound, even when it measures nothing in particular. London kept inventing spaces that had to be policed because they were pleasant. Parks developed dusk. Embankments acquired benches. Railway termini expectorated strangers at hours that made suspicion frugal. Gaslight turned streets into drawing rooms. With poorer furniture, and promenading became democratic. The vice police learned the vocabulary of silhouettes, the posture of loitering, the shuffle of bargaining, the modesty of cold. They learned to stand sotto voce, to drift toward commotion as softly as fog. Their adversary was not wickedness, which is rare and usually busy elsewhere. It was ambiguity. Two people might be anything until they were not, which put enormous pressure on the constable's eyebrows. He raised them. They resolved into cousins waiting for a cab. He lowered them. They reassembled into negotiation. The notebook did its best to keep up, and when in doubt, recorded the weather, a topic that has never embarrassed a court. Magistrates' courts were the city's daytime confessional, presided over by men who liked punctuality and plain speech. Cases moved along in orderly shoals: drunkenness, disorder, small thefts. Indecencies charged with language so careful you might not notice the meaning unless you had trained for it, which the clerks had. Women stood accused of importuning, a legal verb that means to ask insistently, but in practice meant to reveal how elastic asking can be. Fines were common, sentences brief, lectures plentiful. The law aspired to even-handedness and often achieved careful handwriting instead. Reporters sat in the back, transcribing moral arithmetic with the patience of watchmakers. Papers printed abbreviated names, J, Mrs. P, as if discretion were a set of dashes rented by the line. Readers nodded solemnly, folded there. Newspapers, and told the story anyway, over supper. Privacy is a policy with many loopholes, most of them intentional dot maps changed in response to these campaigns. Streets earned reputations the way cats earn favorite windowsills. The Strand practiced bustle 4 nights a week, and opera on the 5th. Piccadilly learned to rearrange its eyebrows depending on the hour. Whitechapel, perpetually described as Notorious was also notable for its bakeries, which the vice police appreciated during long surveillance with short pastries. Lighting improved, which pleased reformers and moths alike. Police stations sprouted on corners where they looked sternly useful, and public urinals arrived with great municipal pride, like small temples to practicality. Signage multiplied. No. Loitering. No soliciting. No singing after midnight, although the last proved unenforceable against determined tenors. Virtue, it turned out, could be encouraged by lamps, benches, and the occasional politely worded notice. Urban planning joined the moral crusade and brought with it the comforting rustle of blueprints. The fight for morality also created an enormous quantity of paper. Petitions rippled through Parliament like polite waves. Pamphlets explained the dangers of novels in sentences longer than most novels. Blue books collected testimony until even. Testimony felt documented. Committees summoned experts on matters that sound expansive and are not. The correct height of a fence around a park to discourage lingering. The optimal distance between gas lamps for public virtue. The effect of rain. On temptation. A few officials developed a passionate interest in statistics and produced tables in which vice rose or fell according to the price of coal, the phase of the moon, and the enthusiasm of the clerk. Numbers, when properly stacked, looked like progress. They induced a civic sleepiness from which only biscuits could rouse the participants. Of course, the city never reached an ending. It prefers continuations. Morality advanced apace. Commerce sidled apace. Privacy invented a new curtain. The vice police aged into routine and then into memory, where their boots tap forever along a pavement that never truly wears out. Some things improved. Children were better protected. Exploitation gained names that made it prosecutable. Other things remained politely complicated as a conversation between two people who both need rent. The law kept revising. The margin between public and private, moving the pencil line a little left, a little right, in response to seasons, elections, and the enduring belief that if one more committee met, the human heart would accept an agenda. In the quieter corners, where lectures end and laundry continues, you could find the everyday, policemen who paid for soup at the same counter as the women they had cautioned, landladies who understood both the rent and the reasons, street missionaries, who learned that tea solves only the problems that tea can reach. The contest for virtue looked, close up, like a series of small negotiations about shelter, money, and time. A constable's kindness might cancel a fine. A magistrate's impatience might invent one. A superintendent might decide that the city slept best when the rules breathed a little. None of this makes an epic, which is why it helps with sleep. Epics are loud. Bureaucracy is a quilt. If you picture it now, imagine a winter night when the fog stands like furniture and the lamps put halos on puddles. An officer writes his report beneath a bracket lamp that flickers with a sense of narrative, but contains none. He notes the hour, the location, the remark from a gentleman who mistook him for a doorman, the woman who laughed and then did not, the house where music practiced discretion, the cafe whose cocoa was better than its morals. He closes the notebook, and the city closes a little with it. Somewhere a society meeting concludes with a vote to adjourn and a plan to reconvene after Easter. A bench remembers the warmth of two strangers, but not their words. In the distance, a bell marks a time that is already turning into a statistic. The boots find their way back to the station, careful not to wake anyone. Morality sleeps too, eventually. It has had a long day supervising lampposts. And because the city is never finished with any of us, the morning will sort itself as mornings do. Office clerks will stack yesterday's decency into files that outlive gossip. Street sweepers will erase evidence of last night's intentions with the calm authority of brooms. A magistrate will reach for his spectacles and his temper in that order. Reformers will post letters that rustle with concern, and the recipients will fold them carefully and place them beside the bread bin. The vice police will start another shift, still listening for trouble that sounds exactly like conversation. Nothing conclusive will happen, which is very Victorian and also rather gentle. The city will continue its quiet arithmetic of allowances and admonitions, and the notebook will open again to a fresh page, blank as a promise, faintly ruled like good intentions. If you have not already drifted off, the page will do it for you. It is the softest thing in the whole room. You might not expect the angle of a monocle to influence a national scandal, but in Victorian drawing rooms, the degree of tilt could mean merely intrigued or positively outraged. Everything had a signal. A fan close swiftly suggested weather. A fan close slowly suggested rumor. Two slow closures in sequence suggested rumor with upholstery. The court circular recorded who dined with whom using commas so well behaved that even impropriety looked tidy. Beneath those commas, small breezes of gossip moved the heavy curtains, and footmen learned to carry trays at the exact speed that allowed names to spread without the teacups rattling. If you're still awake when we reach the exact diameter of a proper calling card tray, feel free to subscribe, or just picture a silver dish the size of a circumspect saucer and let your eyelids do what lids do. Affairs among the mighty rarely exploded. They seeped. Consider the way a carriage route might alter by a single turn so that two people, both famous for being related to people with titles, could observe the park together from a safe angle. The coachman sat high, and the horses minded their own. Large business. Nevertheless, one circuit of the Serpentine at an unusual hour could produce 12 conversations by nightfall, more if the weather favored strolling. Newspapers helped in their mannered way. An evening sheet might mention a house. Party at Tranby Croft, where whist had been played in a spirited fashion, and those who understood spirited whist understood everything. The telegraph made rumor brisk. A wire that could deliver wheat prices could also deliver that the princess's cousin looked pale, pallor being always either a symptom of love or of drafts. Society preferred the diagnosis that made better. Anecdote. The equipment of discretion had its own vocabulary, as comforting as upholstery. There were cream-colored envelopes thick enough to mean business and thin enough to vanish if necessary. There were hotel registers where a hand that was habitually neat learned to flourish. There was the small, crucial distinction between sealing, wax and wafer, the former suggesting intimacy that respected drying times. Bouquets told patient stories. White camellias invited admiration at a distance. Scarlet geraniums were for window boxes and never for secrets. Pansies murmured, "Think of me," with the kind of face that drew caricaturists. The language of flowers made a perfect code because it remained plausible to the innocent. No one was ever arrested for hydrangeas. A bored duchess could thus carry an essay in her bouquet, and only the florist knew that. Footnotes. The royal sphere added a trumpet mute to everything. When a prince changed waistcoats in a railway carriage, someone somewhere was prepared to interpret. The color. A creamy waistcoat meant late breakfast. A daring pattern meant late nights. Both together suggested baccarat. The Tranby Croft affair, famous for its cards and its caution, involved gentlemen who accused a future king of cheating by cutting cards as if they were cucumbers. The game's rules were easy to learn, but difficult to ignore once money and honor sat at the same table. Testimony later employed verbs like shuffle and observe with courtroom gravity, and the world discovered that moral earthquakes can register in the precise angle of a pack. It is very hard to riot over a pack of cards, which is perhaps why the incident calmed the nation by exciting it so tamely. A polite scandal is the 19th century's version of a sedative. Names floated above these stories like Cream Langtree, Mordaunt, work names that sound like hats. Lily Langtree, whose face seemed invented for cigarette cards and whose voice could domesticate a theater, managed the admirable trick of becoming both a celebrity and a gentle euphemism. When people said Jersey Lily, they meant a flower, a play, a photograph, and sometimes a prince. And yet dinner still began at 8. Lady Mordaunt's sorrowful divorce case filled pages with phrases such as most improper familiarity, which proves that if you place most before anything, it sounds like a butler is speaking. Daisy, Countess of Warwick, carried gossip in her very nickname. The flower does not blush, the editors politely did, and then printed her anyway. If high society had a national bird, it would have been the skylark, cheerful, high-flying, and impossible to pin to a precise address. Even quiet rumors required infrastructure. Butlers arranged geography like engineers, placing guests so that conversation flowed the direction of the host's intentions. Pairs who needed to be separated found themselves on opposite sides of soup, which in certain houses had the width of a minor canal. Hostesses deployed the dinner gong with a conductor's sense of tempo, summoning the company away from alcoves whose acoustics were known to the staff. In the morning, housemaids found the day's headline in the ash, the thickness of burnt, paper revealing the number of letters revised after midnight. A good fire eats secrets with appetite but not haste. One could almost time repentance by the glow. In great hotels, chambermaids became accidental archivists, noting the cohabitations that dared not appear in guest books and remembering them only long enough to forget them thoroughly. The salon replaced the courtroom as the preferred venue for verdicts. A remark dropped from a sofa cushion and retrieved by a companionable spaniel could circle Mayfair by tea. Whispering had its own etiquette, measured in inches from a lace collar. Men supplied details, women supplied continuity. The newspapers supplied ellipses. There were rules. A royal personage could be alluded to by the pronoun someone spoken with sufficient italics. A duke might be referred to as the house, as though he were simultaneously a person and a building, which in practical matters he was. The most lethal weapon in all of London was not a pistol or a pamphlet, but a pause after the word indeed. Deployed correctly, it could end a season. The great households staged themselves against scandal like forts against weather. Portraits were rehung so that ancestral eyes watched doorways with improved angles. Conservatories were inspected for shadows that suggested complicated meetings. Gardeners were instructed to raise ferns to restore innocence. Men installed electric bells to summon servants quickly during awkward surprises and pretended the bells were for retrieving extra muffins. Women learned that small dogs could be trained to bark exactly at the moment a conversation needed an ending. In the country, drives were mapped so that carriages met only in combinations approved by tact. The mapping looked like leisure and felt like logistics. Nothing says romance quite like a pencil line on a plan of the West Lawn. Not all rumors were unfriendly. Some were simply energetic. The presence of the Prince of Wales at a party could upgrade a rumor into a limited edition. He had a gift for looking amused by the existence of furniture, which put people at ease and made sideboards feel admired. His friendships with actresses and hostesses did more for the British restaurant trade than most acts of parliament, because a scandal is hungry work, and an after-theater supper always tastes better when the pudding comes with an anecdote. There is a theory that royalty exists to make minutes more interesting. If so, the late Victorian minute was exceptionally alert. Though it still wore gloves, society's newspapers became soporific engines of titillation, which is a complicated way of saying they printed names without verbs. The Morning Post would announce that Lady X had lunched with Lady Y, both newly returned from Z, and readers, like industrious algebra students, supplied the equation. The Illustrated London News printed engravings of garden parties in which hats looked like ambitious. Pastries. Even the sober court circular, that temple of commas, aligned its punctuation with curiosity, arranging attendances so that a certain gentleman never appeared beside a certain lady unless a charity concert provided cover. Readers skimmed for adjacency the way meteorologists search for ISO-BARS. When scandal did insist on publicity, it arrived wearing the most legal footwear. Solicitors' letters cut sharper than knives. Barristers questioned footmen with a courtesy that felt like embroidery. Juries learned a new vocabulary of compromising positions, which seemed to require furniture most houses didn't own. The public, grateful for narrative that promised to be exciting and turned out to be mostly adjectives, followed each detail like a cat following a sunbeam. And then, as always, the case ended with a document. Society loves closure written on good paper. Settlements were rumored in sums compared to the price of a small railway, which was the era's favorite unit of measurement for anything excessive. Meanwhile, in the quieter wings of these houses, life continued its unglamorous duties. Kitchen. Clerks tallied the sherry missing after parties where conversation needed lubrication. Valets sighed over collar studs rescued from carpets that could have told stories if loomings could talk. Dressmakers stayed up late transforming too noticeable gowns into already worn gowns with the addition of clever trimmings, a costume equivalent of memory loss. Florists sat invoices with the solemn discretion of diplomats. Pianists played waltzes thoughtfully enough that people believed they were not dancing out of strategy. The machinery of reputation murmured along, respectful as a sewing machine and just as inexorable. One of the most Victorian facts about these affairs is how often they turned into philanthropy. A liaison might leave behind not a broken home, but a hospital wing, mysteriously funded. A rumor might settle into a scholarship for promising boys, as if embarrassment could be laundered into opportunity with sufficient starch. Subscriptions were raised for good causes at precisely those parties that made subscriptions necessary. A duchess would lean over a ledger and discover that scandal could be itemized at 5 guineas a wine. This worked for everyone. The poor received something that was not gossip. The rich received something that was. Years changed fashions and rumors adjusted their wardrobes. Bustles retreated. Hemlines negotiated with carpets. Mustaches reconsidered their width. But the momentum of talk remained constant. It flowed through ballrooms and along garden paths. It fluttered at the edge of stage curtains and hovered politely at church doors, never interrupting hymns. On Sundays, sermons hinted that the wages of sin were considerable enough to finance a new parish hall. On Mondays, all was forgotten until dinner, when remembering is social rather than spiritual. Memory performed like a string quartet, in tune, well-behaved, and entirely dependent on who turned the pages. By the end of the century, certain reputations had thickened into legend. Lily could command a room with an entrance and a simple sentence about the weather, which is the most British superpower available. Daisy could make a political conversation seem like flirtation, and a flirtation seem like politics, to the benefit of both. A royal personage could inaugurate a peer, and a rumor simultaneously, and neither would rust if properly painted. The public, for its part, developed the useful habit of believing everything a week later, when it hurt no one except the truth, which is older than everyone and doesn't mind. If you're drifting now, that's appropriate. The subject encourages a drowsy moral algebra. Privilege plus opportunity equals anecdote, minus consequences divided by upholstery. Imagine, if you like, the hush after a garden party when the lanterns are being unhooked and the lawn looks relieved. Somewhere a butler locks the silver pantry and smiles because all the teaspoons returned safely victory. In a bedroom full of lace, a lady removes a hairpin that held not only her hair but the day's pretense, and she feels lighter by the weight of one small metal fact. A gentleman opens a letter that says nothing whatsoever in exquisite prose, and knows exactly what it means. The city sorts itself into bedtime stories, and the headlines cool to embers. Tomorrow will begin with the same rituals. Carriages will line up like well-mannered thoughts. Hat brims will signal intentions subtler than semaphore. A bouquet will convey a paragraph that the gardener edits with a pair of shears. The court circular will usher names across the page like guests into a room. The gossip columns will exchange nods with the truth and then look away. Another house party will be announced, another card game dealt. Another charity concert will provide the approved punctuation between two names that should not touch. And somewhere a tray will gleam at precisely 6.5 inches across, ready for visiting cards and unvisited possibilities. If you're still awake, you can imagine the tray's quiet orbit from hallway to hall and back again. If you're not, that's fine. The rumors will continue without you, as patient as silver, and just as soft in the dark. You might not expect a brown paper wrapper to redraw a city, but in late Victorian Britain, those quiet sleeves of paper did exactly that. They traced invisible paths from Holywell Street to suburban parlors, from railway kiosks to boarding houses, with very upright chairs, and from post office counters to mantel clocks that ticked like conspirators. The wrapper said nothing and therefore suggested everything. Stationers stocked it in 3 weights, because discretion, too, comes in grades. Clerks tied parcels with twine at a pressure that left no marks on the contents, an art form rarely celebrated and arguably overdue for a small plaque. If you're still awake when I get to the exact ribbon width preferred by the discreetly curious, feel free to subscribe, though you could also just let your eyes follow the twine around the package and rest where knots become pillows. Holywell Street, tucked off the Strand, acquired the nickname Booksellers' Row, which is the polite way of saying here, but not too loudly. Shop windows offered legitimate classics in the front, and in the back, behind curtains the color of respectability, catalogs as delicately phrased as they were unambiguous to anyone with a pulse and a dictionary. The great decor of secrecy was the stereoscope. Those tidy twin images, 3 by 7 inches, tidy enough to look innocent at a picnic promised depth when paired like moral intention and actual behavior. Stereographs of alpine scenery sat beside continental studies, a phrase that somehow made everything sound like geography homework. Browsers learned to pick up a card and hold it to the light with the same concentration they reserved for poems. It is difficult to sin while squinting. Victorians valiantly tried. The law, never fond of squinting, preferred thicker lines. The Obscene Publications Act of 1857, Lord Campbell's contribution to the nation's collection of serious phrases, gave magistrates the power to seize offensive material, though offensive proved to be a spiritual cousin of "I'll know it when I see it." Printers answered with ingenuity, tip in plates that could be tipped out, cancel leaves that canceled arrest warrants if you had nimble fingers, untitle pages so prim that even vicars blushed at their own suspicions. Catalogs used a thesaurus of coyness facetious, curiosa, marriage hygiene, and the ever-present for private circulation. That last label was 1 part marketing, 1 part alibi, and entirely effective. If a book declared itself shy, who were you to contradict it? Photography performed the quietest revolution. The carte de visite boom had already trained the nation to treasure small likenesses. It did not require heroism to slide a different sort of likeness into a pocket. Photographic studios reportedly kept a second drawer, not sinister so much as supplemental, which opened only after a cough at the counter suggested shared vocabulary. The camera shutter's soft click about the sound of a polite, throat-clear-made, respectability sound cooperative. Albums traveled under shawls labeled Seaside Memories, and in a sense they were People Are Coasts and the Victorians. Did like a promenade. Later in the century, Mutoscope peeps with names that sounded like household farce began to appear on piers. A penny bought a flutter of frames and the kind of depth that stereoscopes had politely promised. The tide, as always, kept its counsel that no enterprise prospers without logistics, and Victorian logistics were as soothing as ledger lines. The postal system, pride of an empire that loves stamps almost as much as it loves stamp duties, moved sealed. Envelopes at a pace determined by horses and hope. Parcels crossed desks labeled perishables and periodicals, occasionally masquerading as the latter because periodicals sound educated even when they are not. Customs officials knew the difference between botanical diagrams and the sort of plant life that grew in Parisian print shops. But the dance of declaration continued anyway. Senders wrote books, receivers nodded indeed, and the general. Post office hummed like a large, benevolent beehive pretending not to hear. Somewhere in the dead letter office, a clerk weighed a suspicious package and wrote the number on a slip. Moral uncertainty, it turns out, weighs 11 ounces, the clientele, was broader than the caricature suggests. Working men pulled pennies for a peek at a penny peep. Clerks traded pamphlets the way some people trade sandwich recipes. And the middle class, which specialized in the art of locked furniture, invented entire categories of cabinetry. There were whatnots with a whatnot, and bookcases with a false shelf, whose hinge squeaked at a volume that librarians would describe as lightly read. Gentlemen bibliophiles compiled private catalogs in copperplate neat enough to justify almost anything. Henry Spencer Ashby, a man with more aliases than most novels have chapters, recorded titles with a focus so tender it felt like gardening. He measured spines, commented on paper quality, annotated with a restraint that would have pleased a bishop, and hid behind the pen name Pisanus Fraxi as if Latin were a cloak with pockets. If you've begun the drift, imagine his ruler tapping. Quietly along the shelf, a lullaby in inches, publishing societies multiplied in this soft twilight. The Kama Shastra Society, a remarkable combination of scholarship, bravado, and extremely limited print runs, produced translations with title pages that looked as sober as a school report. Copies were for subscribers only, a phrase that can make a catalog feel like a club, and a club feel like a confessional. Private presses preferred small numbers, not only to avoid the law, but to flatter the reader. Exclusivity is a blanket that keeps the conscience warm. Medical treatises traveled the same lanes. Marriage manuals explained physiology with diagrams, resembling railway maps and footnotes that cleared their throat every other sentence. For the married, declared a typical cover, and if you were not, the words worked like a velvet rope. You could step over in the privacy of your armchair. Households, adapted to the mild choreography of concealment. Keys proliferated. The domestic economy learned to live with drawers that required 2 hands and half a story to open. Dusting taught servants the geography of their employer's prudence. A maid who returned a book to a different shelf might, 'cause a week's worth of heart arithmetic. Valets developed a look somewhere between tact and cartography, used when a master asked whether a mislaid volume had been seen. The answer was invariably, "Not by me, sir," a sentence so perfectly balanced it could have been used to level tables. In seaside boarding houses, landladies developed a sixth sense for the extra newspaper tucked around an extra parcel, and the precise portion of innocence required to accept the extra tip. Retail followed the railway. Bookstalls that sold adventure. Stories to commuters learned the profitable art of not asking questions once the evening train had whistled and the station lamps suggested privacy. Traveling libraries, those good, earnest cabinets on wheels carried sermons on top and sensation at the back, and the catalogs allowed customers to request items by number, which is the most discreet language ever spoken. On piers, coin-operated. Machines acquired flaps with names that did not describe the contents, like maritime curios, proof that naming is simply another wrapper. The most popular models clicked at a rate that matched the breathing of a person telling themselves. They were not, in fact, excited. Opposition, to its credit, organized as efficiently as any publisher. The Society for the Suppression of Vice patrolled with blue pencils sharpened to administrative points. Magistrates issued orders, policemen produced sacks. Printers watched their type march to bonfires in yards that smelled of ink and damp wood. Reports described seizures in the tidy arithmetic of bureaucracy. So many copies, so many plates, so many arrests, all rendered in numerals that looked stern on the page and faint in the memory. Campaigners gave speeches using sentences long, enough to wrap around a suspect book twice. The paradox remained charmingly insoluble. Publicizing the danger warned the public into curiosity. The most powerful advertisement is a frown. Across the channel, Paris and Brussels worked like helpful, if slightly mischievous, cousins. Engravers with an eye for drapery and a lively hatred of drapery exported albums under covers innocently. Titled Etudes, British customs learned French faster than most schoolchildren. So did gentlemen who needed just enough vocabulary to describe packaging to a solicitor. The very word continental acquired a temperature. It meant pastry, railway timetables, and a certain clarity about the human form, none of which the island nation completely disapproved of. Packages arrived labeled medical plates, and to be fair, many included the sort of labeling doctors adore: figures, letters, arrows, and an optimistic insistence on proportion.technology, that relentless collaborator quietly lowered barriers. Dry plates made cameras easier to use. Daylight studios learned to position curtains in ways that suggested modesty while accomplishing the opposite. Enlargers hummed with the patient confidence of machines that believed themselves moral neutrals. Meanwhile, printing presses improved their speed without inquiring about purpose. It is hard to picture a machine blushing. Even so, catalogs began to mimic science journals, and science journals politely pretended not to notice. The century's great romance with classification species lists, parliamentary returns, postal directories embraced even the things classification claimed to disapprove. One might say the Victorians filed everything, including temptation. There were misadventures, of course, though most were domestic rather than dramatic. Packages arrived at wrong addresses and were welcomed anyway. A curate borrowed a volume labeled Botany and discovered an immoral sense deciduousness. Family solicitors held envelopes in quarantine until clients remembered their Latin, at which point letters were released like birds. In divorce courts, exhibits emerged from brown wrappers into gaslight and then retreated again as if they had stage fright. The transcripts used the word indecent with such frequency it began to sound like a flower. Judges coughed. Juries counted the ceiling's varnish patterns. Newspapers reported as sensation and then listed names in a tone that said, "We have a vocabulary and we intend to use it gently." If there is a moral to this very quiet story, it is not a complicated one. Curiosity travels at precisely the speed of the Postal Service plus the breeze created by turning a page. Prohibition is excellent at teaching synonyms. Respectability, when combined with manufacturing, produces furniture with locks and a population with keys. And paper deer, rustling, ink-scented paper remains the most Victorian of temptations because it makes noise like thought. Somewhere, a bookseller wraps a thin volume whose title is a riddle and ties a bow that looks like a conclusion. Somewhere else, a collector writes a catalog entry in numbers so exact that sleep itself might be measured. The gaslight lowers. The stereoscope lenses gather a little dust. The sea continues to be the sea beyond the pier. If you're still awake, picture a stack of brown parcels cooling in the night air, each one as harmless and as lively as a whisper waiting for morning. You might not expect a bedroom to rearrange a nation's habits, but in the Victorian age, the bedroom did exactly that, slowly, as if moving furniture in its sleep. The century spent so much time thinking about privacy that it began to build. With it, houses grew corridors like polite hedgerows, letting people pass without brushing against anyone's story. Architects learned to place doors so they did not face other doors, a shy choreography that made hallways feel like waiting rooms for conversation. Carpets thickened not for comfort first, but for sound, the hush of wool becoming a minor moral. Instrument. Bed frames lifted off the floor on tall legs, better for sweeping and incidentally, for declaring that nothing hid under the bed except air, and perhaps a slipper that had lost interest in being a pair. If you're still awake when I get to the exact angle of the privacy screen favored by boarding houses, feel free to subscribe, but truly, there's no rush. We have so many curtains to pass through that you may fall asleep between them. Furniture. Behaved like law and wood. Chests acquired locks, then better locks, then tiny secondary drawers inside the main drawer, a matryoshka of discretion. Wardrobes adopted mirrors, a technological miracle, and also a very patient chaperone. Twin beds crept into middle-class rooms, not because couples disliked one another, but because respectable sleep wanted separate borders. It was like giving each dream a passport. The famous fainting couch appeared part medical idea, part chase. Long with ambitions, angled so that a lady could recline while remaining technically vertical in case advice or smelling salts were required. Washstands multiplied pitchers, towels grew plush. Soap advertised itself with the confidence of a moralist who also made bubbles. Bathrooms, once improvisations, learned their own geography. The heavy door, the small window, the chain that clanked exactly like responsibility. Modern hotels still echo that plan, a distant inheritance of plumbing and propriety that continues to advise us to close the door quietly. Even the windows recruited into the project. Lace curtains filtered sunlight and gossip with equal zeal. Netting gained patterns whose names sounded like social invitations. Nottingham, Honiton, Brussels, and homeowners selected them the way others select tone of voice. The sill became a stage for potted ferns, a scenery of virtue that also blocked sightlines in the most helpful ways. Outside, street lamps put a soft radius on darkness. The new glow encouraged strolling and discouraged surprises, a double service, rendered by glass and gas and the people who trimmed the wicks. At seaside resorts, bathing machines rolled like tiny houses between land and water, an architectural shrug that said, yes, swim, but do it politely, and people did, emerging damp and intact, as if the ocean were a respectable guest room, but simply happened to be salted private life, having built itself a shell, then leaked into public policy with admirable tidiness. The Victorian state learned the calm art of classification. Police forces created special departments whose names sounded as mild as filing systems, and in many ways they were filing systems, only with truncheons. Magistrates encountered a new vocabulary, indecent, immoral, improper, each word like a drawer with a separate key. Public libraries invented restricted shelves, geography where curious books lived behind a counter. You could ask to see them, of course, provided you asked in a voice that sounded as if you weren't really asking. Museums set aside quiet, rooms for statues that wore more marble than they had in antiquity, a stone solution to an unstoned problem. There were travel guides that warned about certain galleries the way weather reports warn about fog. Visibility low, keep your umbrella. Of judgment nearby. The Postal Service, hero of so many Victorian adventures, also became the Empire's confidant. Brown paper and string did not merely wrap. They guaranteed plausible innocence. Clerks learned to weigh discretion the way grocers weigh plums. Envelopes bore delicate stamps that traveled further than many of their owners ever would. There were regulations about sealed packets and regulations about the regulations, and each rule added a small cushion to the sofa of secrecy. Booksellers' catalogs mastered the codebook of coyness, curiosa, facetiae, hygienic, proving that if a society invests enough attention in euphemism, it can balance an entire industry on an adverb. In Parliament debates on morality used sentences so long they could be repurposed as Victorian terraces, well-aligned, densely populated, and always one turn from the sea. Language, never one to miss fashion, changed its wardrobe. Desire went to school and returned, as nerves, vapors, and conditions. Doctors wrote case studies that read like weather diaries: pressure low, pulses fluttering, storms likely near the corset. Manuals explained physiology with a tone of apology, as if the body were a guest who had arrived early. The word hygiene enjoyed an entire career. It consulted for soap, lectured for toothbrushes, and appeared on nearly every package sold in a chemist's shop. Traders learned the exact shade of blue that made labels trustworthy. Advertisements discovered the power of before and after engravings, where before slumped and after stood up straight, as if posture were a moral decision. A euphemism could travel from an advice column to a factory label in a single train ride, taking the 1012 and arriving just in time to name a new product, modest, or reform, or improved. Clothing, meanwhile, carried philosophy in its seams. Corsetry loosened by degrees, which is how most revolutions happen when hooks are involved. Stays yielded to busks that yielded to elastic. A gentle technological march led by dressmakers who understood both anatomy and afternoon tea. Drawers took on lace and then shed some of it. Petticoats learned to be lighter, which was good news, for stairs and lungs alike. From the empire's eastern roots came pajamas, practical garments that crept from men's wardrobes into women's with the stealth of comfort. Nightcaps thinned, slippers softened, and dressing gowns acquired patterns. So intricate they might have been maps back to the bed. Even buttons had opinions about propriety. Their placement on blouses taught a nation which hand belonged, where a tutorial in modesty conducted by tiny circles of bone and shell. Technology, again, carried the luggage. Gas mantles, then electric filaments, softened the light until rooms looked flattered even when people were not. Springs and mattresses learned the grammar of weight. Bedsteads swapped wood for brass, a material that polished like conscience. The hot water bottle became a standard winter resident, shaped like a heart only by accident, though manufacturers allowed the coincidence to continue without comment. On the wall, the clock ticked the way all clocks tick, yet in the Victorian home it sounded a bit like a metronome practicing virtue, not faster, not slower, just steady dot all the while. Education rearranged its timetable. Sex instruction did not yet dare its name, so it arrived wearing other names, including nature study and domestic science, subjects that put cabbage and courtship onto adjacent pages. Advice books told newlyweds to be calm, tidy, and if possible, grateful. The sentences sat up straight and crossed their ankles. Clergy gave discreet sermons that mentioned purity in tones that suggested they had dusted the word first. Parents deployed the birds and the bees, a natural history lecture with wings, and children listened as if memorizing a map of a country they would someday visit by train. The result was not clarity exactly, but a very British compromise. Enough information to avoid catastrophe, not quite enough to make anyone boastful. The legacy threaded itself through law as well. Courtrooms developed ways to discuss private matters in public without alarming the wallpaper. Judges adopted phrases like particular acts and circumstances too delicate, and stenographers perfected the art of recording discretion. Divorce proceedings, often painful under any vocabulary, delivered an administrative poetry of allegations that could be quoted in newspapers without getting anyone arrested. Evidence arrived wrapped in brown paper. It left the same way, as if propriety were both the envelope and the letter. Archives sealed records for decades, which is why modern researchers still open boxes that exhale the patient air of awaiting. Century. Somewhere, even now, a librarian removes a small red ribbon from a file with the cooperation of a cat burglar. Perhaps. The most durable inheritance was the nation's facility with double space, public as a front room, private as a back. Garden. That spatial logic survived street plans and etiquette books, moving into the new century intact. Advertising learned to wink, politics to sermonize, and the home to offer a practiced smile whenever the doorbell rang. Architects retained a love of corridors. Manufacturers kept producing keys. The habit of separate teacups, his and hers, labeled by monogram or by suspicion, persisted on breakfast trays long after anyone remembered why. Hotels maintained the ritual of separate registrations for married and related ladies, a bureaucratic courtesy that was really a pillow for the conscience of the night clerk. Even in our present age of passwords and privacy policies, the default setting for many of our systems is Victorian. A door here, a hinge there, a question. Asked politely and answered even more so. There is also the legacy of collecting. Museums still care for reserved rooms, tucked behind ordinary doors, where art too frank for general display waits in calm company. Scholars request access with letters almost identical to those there. Predecessors used merely typed instead of inked. The catalogs, though digital, keep the old categories because categories are stubborn. We still say family viewing, adult section, parental guidance, small badges of lineage. From a century that sharpened the art of saying a lot with very little, even the modern internet, that vast engine of availability, borrows the Victorian trick of the curtain. Click to confirm your age, pull the lace aside with one finger, proceed with decorum into a room that looks much like the previous room, only with the lamps turned lower. None of this is urgent. It is simply the way customs become furniture. The Victorians tried to domesticate desire, and in so doing, domesticated almost everything around it. They taught doors to close quietly and taught people to read between sentences. They gave soap a mission statement, pajamas a passport, and the Postal Service accommodation for steady nerves. They left us a national talent for varnish, literal and figurative, and a suspicion that drawers should be able to lock even if no one intends to use the key. If you're still listening, picture a quiet terrace at dusk, lace up the windows, a lamp like a halo in each room, a corridor that goes precisely where corridors go. Inside, clocks breathe evenly, beds look thoughtful. In some drawer, a tiny key sleeps beside a ribbon, both patient, both unused. And the house, full of rehearsal, hums as if practicing discretion for an audience that has already fallen gently, gratefully asleep.